Polar bear attacks 67-year-old fisherman on ice. November 5, 2024. Harold Benjamin Collins had been fishing the Arctic waters for 43 years, and in all that time he had never once questioned whether he would return home. The sea was his mistress, unforgiving and cold, but predictable in her cruelty. Bears were different. Bears were calculation and hunger, wrapped in 800 pounds of ivory fur and black intention. On the morning of November 5, 2024, Harold would learn that the ice beneath him was not ground, but merely a frozen promise, one that a determined predator could shatter as easily as a man might crack an egg. The story begins not on that frigid November day, but 6 weeks earlier, in the cramped administrative office of Northern Lights Fisheries, a mid-sized operation based out of Utqiagvik, Alaska, the town that most outsiders still called by its former name, Barrow. The office smelled of coffee that had been reheated too many times, and the perpetual dampness that seemed to seep into every building north of the Arctic Circle. Marcus Delgado, the company's operations manager, sat across from Harold Collins, reviewing the season's plans with the kind of methodical attention that came from 20 years of managing men in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Marcus was 47, originally from Albuquerque, New Mexico, a fact that his co-workers never let him forget during the depths of winter when temperatures plummeted to 50 below zero. He had arrived in Alaska in his mid-20s, chasing a woman who had long since left him, but he had stayed for reasons he could never quite articulate. Perhaps it was the clarity that came with extreme environments, the way survival distilled life down to its essential components. He wore his dark hair short, showing the first substantial threads of silver at his temples, and maintained the kind of lean fitness that came from necessity rather than vanity. His brown eyes, set deep beneath heavy brows, missed very little. Harold sat across from him, a man who seemed carved from the landscape itself. At 67, he carried his years with a dignity that came from having earned every line on his weather-beaten face. He stood 5'10", with broad shoulders that had begun to slope slightly forward, the inevitable consequence of decades spent hunched over nets and lines. His hands were massive, scarred and calloused, the knuckles permanently swollen from arthritis that he treated with ibuprofen and stubbornness. His eyes were a startling blue, almost luminous against his deeply tanned skin, and they held the peculiar steadiness of a man who had stared down death more times than he could count and had always somehow convinced it to look elsewhere. Harold had been married to Judith Collins for 41 years. They had raised 3 children in Utqiagvik, 2 daughters and a son, all of whom had left for warmer climates the moment they graduated high school. Harold didn't blame them. The Arctic was not for everyone. It required a particular hardness, a willingness to accept that comfort was a luxury and survival was the baseline. Judith had that hardness. She was a nurse at the Samuel Simmons Memorial Hospital, and in her spare time, she volunteered with the local search and rescue teams. She had pulled more frozen bodies from the ice than Harold cared to think about, and yet she never suggested they leave. This was home. This was where they belonged. Marcus spread a large map across his desk, weighing down the corners with coffee mugs and a stapler. The map showed the coastline northeast of Utqiagvik, marked with notations in different colors, indicating fishing zones, ice thickness measurements, and wildlife sighting reports. Red marks indicated polar bear activity. There were a lot of red marks. "We've got authorization for the extended season," Marcus said, tapping a finger on a section of coastline approximately 30 miles northeast of town. "But Fish and Wildlife is requiring additional safety protocols this year. Bear activity has been unusually high." Harold leaned forward, studying the map with the intense focus of a man reading his own future. "How high?" 17 documented sightings within our operational zone in the last month. 3 of them involved charges at human activity. No injuries, but they're getting bolder. The ice formed late this year pushed the bears closer to shore longer than usual. They're hungry. Thomas Bright Owl, who had been standing silently by the window, turned at this. Thomas was 42 in Yupiaq and had grown up in Utqiagvik, hunting and fishing with his father and grandfather. He was shorter than both Marcus and Harold, maybe 5'7", but built like a barrel, with immense strength packed into his compact frame. His face was round, with high cheekbones and a wide nose that had been broken at least twice. His black hair was always pulled back in a neat ponytail, and he wore traditional tattoos on his forearms, marks that told the story of his family's connection to this land, going back countless generations. "My uncle saw a big male 2 days ago, maybe 12 miles out," Thomas said. His voice was deep and carried the slight accent of someone who had learned English as a second language. He said the bear watched him for 20 minutes, just stood there watching. That's not normal behavior. Normal bear, he smells you, he leaves. This one was curious. Curious is dangerous. Harold nodded slowly. He had enormous respect for Thomas's judgment. The Inupiaq people had coexisted with polar bears for thousands of years, developing an understanding of the animals that went far beyond scientific observation. It was knowledge passed down through generations, refined by the harsh teacher of trial and error. When Thomas said a bear was dangerous, you listened. "What kind of protocols are we talking about?" Harold asked Marcus. Marcus pulled out a stapled document, the official requirements from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Mandatory bear watch whenever crews are on the ice. That means dedicated personnel doing nothing but scanning for bears, minimum of 1 per crew. Required check-ins every 4 hours via satellite phone. Bear bangers and deterrent spray for every team member. And this is new. They're requiring we carry tranquilizer rifles and have at least 1 person per crew certified in their use. Harold frowned. Tranquilizer rifles? Those things are damn near useless on a polar bear. By the time the drugs kick in, the bear's already on top of you. "I know," Marcus said, "but it's what they're requiring. The alternative is we don't fish." The room fell silent. Not fishing meant no income, and for men like Harold and Thomas, fishing wasn't just a job, it was an identity, a purpose, a connection to something larger than themselves. The Arctic demanded tribute, but it also provided, and there was a kind of spiritual balance in that exchange that men who lived in climate-controlled comfort could never understand. "Who else is going out?" Thomas asked. Marcus consulted his clipboard. "You 3 for sure. Robert Mahoney said he's in. Jennifer Yoon is coming back for the season. David Chen volunteered. That gives us 6 for the primary crew." Robert Mahoney was 28, the youngest of the group, a transplant from Boston who had come north 5 years ago with romantic notions of adventure that had been slowly ground down by the reality of Arctic survival. He was tall and gangly, 6'3", with red hair that he kept shaved to stubble and a perpetual sunburn that never quite healed. Despite his relative inexperience, Robert had proven himself to be hard-working and reliable, qualities that counted for more than natural talent in an environment where mistakes could be fatal. He was single, lived in a studio apartment that he heated with a wood stove, and sent most of his money back to his mother in Dorchester. Jennifer Yoon was 35, Korean-American, originally from Seattle. She had worked fishing boats in Alaska for 12 years, starting in the Bering Sea before gradually working her way north. She was 5'5", lean and muscular, with short black hair and a permanent squint from years of staring into sun reflecting off ice and water. Jennifer was quiet, almost taciturn, but she had a dark sense of humor that emerged during the long hours of tedious work. She had been married once, briefly, to a man who couldn't understand why she kept disappearing north for months at a time. The divorce had been amicable. She had no children and seemed to prefer it that way. David Chen was 49, born in Taiwan but raised in Anchorage. He was medium height, stocky, with glasses that he was constantly adjusting, and a nervous energy that manifested in his habit of always having to be doing something with his hands. When he wasn't working, he was whittling, small sculptures of animals that he gave away to anyone who expressed the slightest interest. David had a wife and 2 teenage daughters in Anchorage. He worked the Arctic fishing season to pay for his daughter's college funds, a sacrifice that his wife both appreciated and resented in equal measure. "That's a solid crew," Harold said. "When do we deploy?" "October 15th. We'll set up the base camp at Drake Point. Fish and Wildlife has cleared that location. The ice surveys show minimum 30 inches throughout the operational zone, which should be solid enough for the sleds and equipment." Drake Point was a desolate stretch of coastline that jutted out into the Beaufort Sea like an accusing finger. It was named after a whaling captain who had lost his ship there in 1873, crushed between ice floes that closed like a vice. The captain and 4 crew members had survived by walking across the ice to shore, a distance of approximately 8 miles. 2 had lost fingers and toes to frostbite, and 1 had gone mad from the experience and had to be restrained. The area had a grim history, which was to say it was like everywhere else in the Arctic, beautiful, deadly, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. Over the next 2 weeks, the crew prepared. Harold spent his evenings at home with Judith, talking about everything except the obvious danger of the upcoming season. They talked about their daughters. Sarah was a lawyer in Portland, Rebecca taught elementary school in Sacramento, and their son Michael, who worked in Seattle doing something with computers that Harold didn't entirely understand, but pretended to. They talked about home repairs that needed to be done, about friends and gossip, about anything that wasn't the fact that Harold was about to spend weeks on the ice in polar bear country. Judith was 64, still beautiful in Harold's eyes, though the years and the climate had carved their presence into her face just as surely as they had his. She was shorter than Harold, 5'4", with grey hair that she kept in a practical shortcut. Her hands were as scarred as Harold's, but from different causes. Years of working with medical equipment, of inserting IVs and stitching wounds. She had seen what the Arctic could do to a human body when things went wrong, and she lived with that knowledge every day. On the night before Harold was scheduled to leave, they sat together on their couch, a worn thing they had bought used 20 years ago, watching the northern lights dance across the sky through their living room window. The lights were particularly spectacular that night, great curtains of green and purple that seemed to pulse with some unknowable rhythm. "You'll be careful," Judith said. It wasn't a question. "Always am," Harold replied. "More careful than always. The bears are hungry this year." Harold put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. She smelled like the lavender soap she special ordered from a company in Oregon. An absurd luxury in a place where most things had to be shipped in at enormous expense. He loved that she insisted on that small indulgence. "Thomas knows these bears better than anyone. We'll be fine." Judith was quiet for a moment, watching the lights. "I pulled a body from the ice 3 years ago. Young man, maybe 25. He'd been attacked by a bear about 10 miles north of here. We found him 2 days after the attack. The bear had..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. The bear had been efficient. Harold knew the incident she was talking about. Everyone in Utqiagvik knew about it. The young man had been a wildlife photographer from Germany, full of enthusiasm and utterly unprepared for the reality of polar bears. He had gotten too close trying to get a photograph. The bear had killed him in approximately 30 seconds. "I know," Harold said quietly, "but I'm not a tourist with a camera. I've been doing this longer than you've been pulling bodies out of the snow." "That's what worries me," Judith said. "You're confident." Confidence makes people careless. She was right, of course. She was usually right. But what was Harold supposed to do? Not go. Fishing was what he did. It was who he was. Asking him to stop was like asking him to stop breathing. They went to bed early that night, lying close together in the darkness, listening to the wind howl outside. The wind was always howling in Utqiagvik, a constant presence that became like white noise after a while, something you only noticed when it stopped. Harold lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, thinking about ice and bears and the peculiar human arrogance that made men believe they could exist in places that clearly didn't want them. October 15th arrived with the kind of cold that made the air itself feel solid. The temperature was -15 Fahrenheit when the crew assembled at the Northern Lights Fisheries warehouse at 6 in the morning. The warehouse was a massive, corrugated metal building at the edge of town, filled with equipment, supplies, and the accumulated detritus of years of Arctic operations. Snowmobiles in various states of repair lined one wall. Fishing nets hung from the ceiling like frozen spiderwebs. The smell was a mixture of machine oil, fish, and diesel fuel. The crew loaded 3 sleds with equipment. The sleds were heavy-duty affairs, specially designed for Arctic conditions, pulled by powerful snowmobiles that could handle rough ice and deep snow. Each sled carried approximately 800 pounds of gear: fishing equipment, food supplies, fuel, sleeping bags, a portable shelter, communication equipment, weapons, and emergency supplies. Marcus conducted a final equipment check, going through each item methodically with a clipboard. Bear spray, check. Bear bangers, check. Satellite phones, check. First aid kits, check. The tranquilizer rifle, an ungainly thing that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie, was secured in a waterproof case. Harold had been required to take a 4-hour training course on how to use it, which had mostly consisted of a fish and wildlife officer explaining all the ways it could fail to work and then making him shoot at targets in an indoor range. Harold had qualified barely, though he had no confidence whatsoever that he could hit a charging polar bear with a tranquilizer dart. Jennifer Yoon was checking the snowmobiles, her breath creating clouds of vapor in the frigid air. She wore heavy insulated coveralls, multiple layers underneath, and a fur-lined hood that obscured most of her face. Only her eyes were visible, dark and alert. "These machines are good," she announced. "Fuel systems are winterized, batteries are fresh, tracks are in good shape. We should have no mechanical issues unless we do something stupid." "Let's try not to do something stupid," Marcus said. Robert Mahoney laughed nervously. This would be his first extended trip to a remote camp, and his anxiety was palpable. He kept checking and rechecking his personal gear, patting his pockets to verify that he had everything he needed. David Chen was characteristically methodical, organizing his supplies with the kind of precise attention to detail that made him an excellent fisherman, but sometimes drove his crewmates crazy. Everything had to be in exactly the right place, secured exactly the right way. He had created a written checklist and was working through it item by item, checking off boxes with a pencil he kept secured to the clipboard with a string. Thomas stood slightly apart from the others, facing northeast toward their destination. He had been quiet all morning, even more than usual, and there was a tension in his posture that Harold recognized. Thomas was listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear, some whisper from the land itself. Harold walked over to him. "What is it?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "My grandmother used to say that the ice has a voice. If you listen carefully, it tells you what's coming." "What's it telling you?" "That we should wait. Give it a few more days." Harold felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "You really believe that?" Thomas turned to look at him. "My grandmother lived to be 97. She spent every winter of her life on the ice. When she died, it was in her sleep, in her bed, surrounded by her family. That's a rare death for our people. I believe that she knew things." "If you think we should wait, we'll wait," Harold said. Thomas shook his head slowly. It's not a certainty, just a feeling. And we have a schedule. People are depending on us. People will always be depending on us. That's not a reason to take unnecessary risks. All risk in the Arctic is necessary, Thomas said. The question is whether the risk is proportional to the reward. We have jobs to do, families to feed. We go. By 7:30, they were ready. Marcus would stay in Utqiagvik to coordinate operations from the office, maintaining regular radio contact and serving as liaison with fish and wildlife. The 6-person crew would make the journey to Drake Point, establish their base camp, and begin fishing operations. The convoy of 3 snowmobiles, each pulling a loaded sled, departed just as the sun was beginning to rise, painting the eastern sky in shades of deep purple and orange. The temperature was -18 and falling. The forecast called for clear skies for the next 3 days, then a possibility of light snow. Wind was expected to remain moderate, 10 to 15 miles per hour from the northwest. Harold drove the lead snowmobile, with Thomas beside him on the second machine and Jennifer on the third. Robert rode with Harold, David with Thomas, and Jennifer pulled the heaviest sled alone. The route to Drake Point followed the coastline, staying on land ice where possible and venturing onto sea ice only when necessary. The ice along the coast had been surveyed extensively and was deemed safe, but safe in the Arctic was always a relative term. The landscape was stunning in its desolation. Endless white stretched in every direction, broken only by pressure ridges where ice floes had collided and pushed upward, creating jagged walls of blue-white ice that looked like frozen waves. The sky was impossibly vast, a dome of pale blue that seemed to curve away to infinity. To the south, the low buildings of Utqiagvik gradually disappeared behind them. To the north, there was nothing but ice and ocean and the occasional dark shape of a seal hole. They traveled in single file, maintaining a distance of about 50 feet between machines. This was standard protocol, close enough to help if someone had trouble, far enough apart that they wouldn't all break through if the ice gave way. Harold kept the speed moderate, around 20 miles per hour. There was no rush. Haste on the ice was how people died. Robert sat behind Harold on the snowmobile, his arms wrapped around Harold's waist, his face pressed against Harold's back to protect it from the wind. Even through all their layers of clothing, Harold could feel Robert shivering. The young man had learned to dress for the cold, but he had never quite adapted to it the way someone who grew up here did. His body fought the temperature constantly, burning calories at an accelerated rate just to maintain core warmth. They stopped every hour for brief breaks, stepping off the machines to stretch, checking equipment, scanning the horizon for bears. The breaks were never longer than 5 or 10 minutes. Stopping meant losing body heat, and regaining it was a slow process, better to keep moving. By noon, they had covered approximately 15 miles. The sun was barely above the horizon, creating long shadows across the ice. They stopped for lunch, gathering the snowmobiles in a tight cluster and forming a windbreak with the sleds. Jennifer produced a thermos of hot coffee and another of soup. They passed them around, grateful for the warmth. David had brought sandwiches, peanut butter and jelly, the kind of thing that wouldn't freeze solid. They ate quickly, mechanically, fueling their bodies rather than enjoying food. Taste was irrelevant. Calories were what mattered. "I saw a seal about 2 miles back," Jennifer said. "Looked like a bearded seal, big one." "Where there are seals, there are bears," Thomas observed. They all understood this. Polar bears existed in a delicate balance with their primary prey. In lean times, they would eat anything: birds, fish, whale carcasses, even human garbage. But seals were what they needed to survive. An adult male polar bear required approximately 66 seals per year to maintain body weight. That was a lot of seals, and it meant the bears were always hunting, always moving, always looking for their next meal. "We should do a perimeter check before we keep going," Harold said. Thomas nodded and pulled out a pair of binoculars. He stood on top of his sled, turning slowly in a complete circle, scanning methodically. The binoculars were high-quality military surplus, with exceptional light-gathering capability. If there was a bear within a mile, Thomas would see it. After 5 minutes, he lowered the binoculars. "Clear," he said. They packed up and continued. The afternoon passed in a blur of white and cold, and the constant throb of snowmobile engines. The monotony was hypnotic. Harold found his mind wandering, thinking about his children, about summers when they were young and the family would camp along the coast, back when the kids still thought the Arctic was an adventure rather than a prison. Sarah, his oldest, had been the first to leave. She was brilliant, driven, had always known she wanted to be a lawyer. She visited once a year, usually in summer, and Harold could see the relief in her eyes when she left, escaping back to Portland, where the temperature stayed above freezing and trees grew. Rebecca was gentler, more conflicted about leaving. She taught second grade and sent Harold pictures of her students, children with diverse faces from families who had come from all over the world. Michael, his son, was the one who had hurt Judith the most by leaving. She had hoped at least one of their children would stay, would raise grandchildren in Utqiagvik, would continue the family connection to this place. But Michael had left at 18 and never looked back, and though he called regularly and spoke with warmth and love, there was a distance there that couldn't be bridged by phone calls. By 4 in the afternoon, the sun was setting, even though sunset wouldn't technically occur for another 2 hours. This far north, the sun never rose very high during this time of year, and the periods of full daylight were brief. In another month, the sun wouldn't rise at all, and they would fish in perpetual twilight and darkness, guided by headlamps and moonlight, and the occasional spectacular display of Aurora Borealis. They reached Drake Point just as the last light was fading from the sky. The location was exactly as described in the survey reports, a flat expanse of ice extending several hundred yards from shore, with good access and relatively smooth terrain. The ice thickness here averaged 34 inches according to the most recent measurements, more than sufficient for their purposes. Setting up camp took nearly 2 hours. They positioned the sleds in a defensive triangle, creating a small protected area in the center. The shelter was a specialized Arctic tent, quadruple-layered with a frame of lightweight aluminum poles. It could comfortably sleep 6 people and had enough interior space for cooking and equipment storage. Jennifer and David set up the tent while Harold and Thomas used a power auger to drill holes in the ice for fishing. Robert was tasked with organizing the interior of the tent, setting up sleeping bags, arranging supplies, and getting the portable propane heater running. By 6 in the evening, they had a functioning camp. The tent glowed like a beacon in the darkness, light from their LED lanterns creating a small sphere of warmth and humanity in the vast Arctic night. The temperature had dropped to -25. Wind was picking up, gusting to maybe 20 miles per hour, making it feel even colder. They gathered inside the tent for their first meal at Drake Point. Jennifer had prepared a stew in a large pot on their propane stove, beef, potatoes, carrots, onions, swimming in rich gravy. It was heavy, calorie-dense food, exactly what they needed. They ate in relative silence, too tired for much conversation, then settled in for the night. Thomas and Harold took the first watch. Watch duty was 2 hours per person, rotating through the crew. The person on watch sat at the tent entrance, visible from inside, but able to see out, armed with a rifle and binoculars, scanning for bears. It was cold, tedious work, but absolutely essential. Harold sat bundled in his heaviest parka, his rifle across his lap, staring out into darkness that was absolute. There was no moon tonight, and clouds had moved in, obscuring the stars. He could hear the ice groaning and cracking in the distance, the sound of immense forces at work beneath the frozen surface. The ocean was never still, even when covered by ice, and the constant movement created a symphony of creaks and pops. And occasional booms that sounded like distant artillery. His radio crackled to life. "Drake Point, this is base. How do you read?" It was Marcus, checking in from Utqiagvik. Harold keyed the radio. "Base, this is Drake Point. I read you 5 by 5. Camp established, all personnel accounted for, no issues." "Copy that, Drake Point. Weather forecast still looks good for the next 48 hours. Light snow possible on day 3. How's morale?" "Tired but good. We'll start fishing operations at first light." "Understood. Check in again at 0600. Base out." Harold clipped the radio back to his belt. The routine of it was comforting. The regular check-ins, the protocols, the sense that someone back in civilization was keeping track of them. It was an illusion, of course. If something went catastrophically wrong out here, there was very little Marcus or anyone else could do to help them quickly. The nearest rescue helicopter was at least an hour away in good weather, and good weather in the Arctic was never guaranteed. Thomas emerged from the tent, moving with the careful economy of motion that came from years of Arctic experience. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee, steam rising from them in the frigid air. He handed one to Harold. "Thought you might need this," Thomas said. "Thanks." Harold took the cup gratefully, wrapping his gloved hands around it. Thomas settled down next to him, both men sitting on a supply crate, staring out into the darkness. For a long time, neither spoke. There was a comfortable quality to the silence between them, born from years of working together in conditions where unnecessary words were a waste of energy. Finally, Thomas said, "My grandfather told me a story once about a bear that stalked his hunting party for 3 days." Harold glanced at him. Thomas didn't often share stories from his family traditions, and when he did, there was usually a reason. "The bear never attacked," Thomas continued, "just followed them. Stayed maybe half a mile away, always visible, always watching. My grandfather said it was the most terrifying hunt of his life because they never knew if the bear was waiting for them to make a mistake or if it was just curious. On the 3rd day, they reached a village and the bear turned around and left." "What's the lesson?" Harold asked. "That sometimes the bear lets you live and you never know why. Maybe it wasn't hungry enough. Maybe it decided you weren't worth the risk. Maybe it was playing a game you don't understand. But you don't get to decide if you live or die. The bear decides." Harold absorbed this in silence. The story was both comforting and deeply unsettling. He wanted to believe that his experience, his preparation, his caution would keep him safe. But Thomas was suggesting that ultimately survival in bear country was about luck as much as skill. "You really think we should have waited?" Harold said quietly. "I think the ice is restless this year. I think the bears are hungry. I think we're taking a calculated risk, and the calculation might be wrong." Thomas paused. "But I also think we're as prepared as we can be, and sometimes you have to trust in your preparation." Harold's watch passed without incident. At midnight, Jennifer relieved him, and he crawled into his sleeping bag, already half frozen despite all his layers. The tent was warm relative to outside, maybe 40 degrees Fahrenheit, but still cold enough that frost formed on the inside of the fabric. He could hear David snoring softly, Robert shifting restlessly, Thomas breathing with the deep rhythm of someone in genuine sleep. Harold closed his eyes and tried to quiet his mind. Tomorrow they would begin fishing in earnest, and he needed rest. But sleep was elusive. He kept thinking about Thomas's story, about the bear that followed for 3 days and then left, about the arbitrary nature of survival, about Judith, warm and safe in their house in Utqiagvik, probably lying awake worrying about him. Eventually, exhaustion overtook anxiety and Harold slept. The next 10 days established a routine that was both monotonous and physically demanding. They woke before dawn, which came late and left early this time of year, ate a quick breakfast, and spent 8 to 10 hours fishing. The method was traditional ice fishing scaled up to commercial levels. They maintained 6 holes, each approximately 18 inches in diameter, drilling through the 30-plus inches of ice using power augers. Lines were baited and dropped, weighted to reach the proper depth. The fish they were targeting were Arctic cod, a small but plentiful species that schooled in large numbers beneath the ice. The catch was good, better than expected actually. By the end of the first week, they had pulled nearly 3,000 pounds of fish from the ice, packing them in insulated containers with dry ice for transport back to Utqiagvik. The work was brutally cold, standing or kneeling on ice for hours, hands repeatedly exposed to -20-degree air as they baited hooks and pulled lines. Even with the best gloves, the cold penetrated, turning fingers into clumsy clubs. But the crew was experienced, and they fell into the rhythm of it. David proved to be the fastest at baiting hooks, his nervous energy channeled into rapid, precise movements. Jennifer had an almost supernatural ability to sense when fish were biting, some combination of feeling the line tension and reading subtle cues that the rest of them missed. Robert, despite his relative inexperience, was tireless, willing to do whatever needed doing without complaint. Thomas and Harold, as the senior members, supervised and made decisions about where to position holes and when to move to new locations. They saw seals regularly, dark shapes that would surface in leads between ice flows, regarding the humans with curious eyes before sliding back beneath the surface. Once, they saw a pod of beluga whales, their white backs breaking the surface like small islands. Birds were scarce this late in the season. Most had migrated south, but occasionally they'd spot an ivory gull or a raven. They did not see bears, not in those first 10 days. But the awareness of bears was constant, a low-level anxiety that never quite disappeared. Every few hours, someone would scan the horizon with binoculars. At night, the watch was maintained without fail. They had several false alarms, shadows that could have been bears, but turned out to be pressure ridges or equipment, sounds that seemed too deliberate, but were just the ice settling. Marcus checked in twice daily, morning and evening, maintaining the radio schedule with military precision. On day 8, he reported that a bear had been spotted in Utqiagvik, wandering through town before being hazed away by fish and wildlife officers using rubber bullets and noisemakers. This happened occasionally, bears that had become too comfortable around humans, and it usually ended with the bear being relocated or, in extreme cases, destroyed. This one had apparently gotten the message and headed back out onto the ice. "They're pushing closer to human activity," Marcus said over the radio. "Food sources are scarce. Stay alert." On day 10, the weather changed. A storm system moved in from the northwest, bringing heavy snow and winds gusting to 40 miles per hour. Fishing was impossible in those conditions. They retreated to the tent and waited it out, a period of enforced inactivity that tested everyone's patience. Being confined in close quarters with 5 other people, unable to go outside except for brief, necessary trips, was its own kind of challenge. The tent felt simultaneously too small and too isolated. Condensation from their breathing formed frost on the interior walls. The sound of wind battering the fabric was constant, a roar that made conversation difficult. They played cards, a battered deck that Jennifer had brought, with several cards missing, so they had to improvise rules. David whittled, creating tiny seals and bears and fish from scraps of wood. Robert wrote in a journal, filling page after page with cramped handwriting. Thomas mostly sat quietly, occasionally checking their supplies, doing mental calculations about remaining food and fuel. Harold found himself thinking about home more than usual, about Judith's face, the way she looked at him over morning coffee, about his children scattered across the continent, about the house he and Judith had lived in for 37 years, with its creaky floors and the window in the kitchen that never quite closed right. Small things, mundane things, that suddenly felt precious. On the evening of day 11, the storm broke. The wind dropped suddenly, and within an hour, the sky was clear. The temperature plummeted to -35, the kind of cold that seemed to have physical weight. But they could work again, and after a day of forced rest, everyone was eager to return to fishing. They resumed operations on day 12. The ice was covered with fresh snow, nearly 2 feet of it, pristine and unmarked. They had to clear their fishing holes, breaking through the ice that had formed in the holes during the storm. It took most of the morning, hard physical labor with ice chippers and shovels. By afternoon, lines were in the water again, and the rhythm of work resumed. The catch that day was lighter. Perhaps the storm had scattered the fish, or maybe they had simply depleted the local population. Thomas suggested moving their operation about a mile east, to a location he thought might be more productive. They planned to make the move the next day. That night, David was on watch when he thought he saw something moving in the distance. He woke Harold, who came out and stood beside him, staring in the direction David indicated. They watched for 10 minutes, binoculars pressed to their eyes, but saw nothing. Could have been blowing snow, could have been a trick of the darkness and their imagination, could have been a bear. "We'll do an extended perimeter check in the morning," Harold decided. "If there's a bear nearby, we need to know about it." Day 13, October 28th, dawned clear and cold. -38 degrees Fahrenheit. Light wind from the north, perfect conditions for fishing, terrible conditions for human survival without proper preparation. They had been out for 13 days now, with supplies sufficient for another 12. The plan was to fish through mid-November, then return to Utqiagvik for resupply, before potentially going out for another rotation. After breakfast, Harold and Thomas conducted the perimeter check. They took one snowmobile and traveled in a wide circle around the camp, looking for tracks, scat, any sign of bear activity. They found nothing conclusive, though about half a mile north of camp, they came across what might have been tracks, partially obscured by blowing snow. They were large depressions, roughly the right size and spacing for a polar bear, but impossible to confirm with certainty. "Could be old tracks from before the storm," Harold suggested. "Could be," Thomas agreed, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it. They returned to camp and made the decision to proceed with the planned relocation. The new fishing site was approximately a mile east, along the same general stretch of coastline. They would move the entire camp, tent, equipment, sleds, to the new location and set up again. It was a significant undertaking, requiring several hours of work, but they had done it before. The move went smoothly. By early afternoon, they had the tent re-established at the new location and were drilling fresh fishing holes. The ice here was slightly thicker, averaging 38 inches, which was excellent. Thomas pronounced himself satisfied with the location, pointing out signs of fish activity below the ice, slight discolorations in the ice that suggested schools moving beneath. They fished until evening, pulling in a decent catch, better than the previous 2 days. Spirits were good. Robert cracked jokes, doing a passable impression of Marcus that made everyone laugh. Jennifer shared photos on her phone. She had a solar charger and tried to keep the battery alive, showing them pictures from previous seasons, other crews, other times. David demonstrated his latest whittling project, a tiny but remarkably detailed polar bear that he said he would give to his younger daughter. As darkness fell, they prepared the evening meal, canned chili heated in the pot, cornbread made from a mix, coffee strong enough to strip paint. They ate inside the tent, grateful for the warmth, tired but satisfied with the day's work. Harold took first watch that night. Jennifer would relieve him at 10, then David at midnight, Robert at 2, and Thomas would take the last shift from 4 until 6. It was a system that had worked well for nearly 2 weeks. Harold bundled up and took his position at the tent entrance. The night was exceptionally clear, and the aurora borealis was putting on a show. Vast curtains of green and purple light rippling across the sky, pulsing with an otherworldly rhythm. It was beautiful enough to make him forget, momentarily, how uncomfortable he was. The ice was active tonight, groaning and cracking with unusual frequency. Large booms echoed across the expanse, some close enough to feel as vibrations through the ice. This was normal, Harold reminded himself. The ice was always moving, always adjusting. Nothing to worry about. At 9:30, he heard a different sound. Not the natural groan of ice, but something else. A crunching, rhythmic sound. Footsteps. Harold's heart began to pound. He raised his binoculars, scanning in the direction of the sound. The aurora provided enough ambient light to see, casting everything in shades of green and grey. There, about 100 yards out, a shape, large, pale, moving with deliberate purpose across the ice. A polar bear. Harold's mouth went dry. He watched through the binoculars as the bear moved parallel to their camp, not approaching directly, but not moving away either. It was a big bear, probably an adult male, maybe 8 feet long and weighing 700 or 800 pounds. Even at this distance, Harold could see the immense power in its movements, the way muscles bunched and released beneath thick fur. The bear stopped, turned its head toward the camp. Even through binoculars, Harold could see the black eyes, the dark nose, the expression that was neither aggressive nor fearful, but simply assessing. They stared at each other across 100 yards of ice. The bear and the human, predator and prey. The moment stretched, seconds feeling like minutes. Then the bear turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the reach of the aurora's light. Harold sat frozen, his heart hammering, adrenaline making his hands shake. After several minutes, he keyed his radio, speaking quietly into it. Drake Point to base. We have a bear sighting, large male, approximately 100 yards from camp. Bear moved off to the northeast. All personnel are safe, maintaining watch protocol. Marcus's reply was immediate, his voice tight with concern. Copy that, Drake Point. Keep me updated. Consider increasing watch frequency. Will do, base, Drake Point out. Harold called into the tent, waking the others. They emerged one by one, pulling on parkas, grabbing rifles and flashlights. Thomas came out last, his face grave. How long ago? Thomas asked. 5 minutes. It was moving northeast. They formed a defensive perimeter, scanning with flashlights and binoculars. The bear was gone, swallowed by the Arctic night. But they all knew it was out there somewhere, and they all knew that a polar bear that had come this close once might come closer next time. We should consider relocating, David said, his voice higher than normal with stress. And go where? Jennifer countered. Any location we move to, the bear can find us again. They can cover enormous distances. If it's stalking us, moving won't help. Jennifer's right, Thomas said. We're committed now. We maintain vigilance, we follow protocols, and we trust our preparation. They maintained a double watch for the rest of the night, 2 people on duty at all times instead of 1. It meant everyone got less sleep, but sleep seemed suddenly far less important than survival. The bear did not return that night, but when morning came and they ventured outside to check the perimeter, they found tracks. Large tracks. Paw prints nearly 12 inches across, the mark of a massive bear. The tracks circled their camp at a distance of about 75 yards, a complete circuit. The bear had been watching them, studying them, learning their patterns and weaknesses. "It's hunting us," Robert said, his voice barely a whisper. Thomas knelt by one of the tracks, studying it with the intensity of someone reading a book. "Not hunting. Not yet. This is reconnaissance. The bear is trying to decide if we're worth the risk. It's a mature male, probably around 10 years old, based on the size. Weight maybe 800 pounds. It's been eating regularly. You can tell by the depth of the tracks relative to the size. A desperate, starving bear would have attacked last night. This one is being cautious." "Cautious isn't good," Jennifer said. "Cautious means smart. Smart means dangerous." Harold was on the radio to Marcus, reporting the new development. Marcus's response was immediate and unequivocal. "Drake Point, this is base. I'm calling this in to Fish and Wildlife. They may want you to evacuate." "Base, we have 2 weeks of supplies left and the fishing is good. If we evacuate now, we lose the entire investment in this operation." There was a long pause. Harold could imagine Marcus in his office, weighing the safety concerns against the economic realities. Northern Lights Fisheries was not a large operation. Losing 2 weeks of fishing could be the difference between a profitable season and a disaster. "Drake Point, the decision is yours to make. You're the crew chief on site, but I want twice daily check-ins now, and I want detailed bear protocols implemented. That means at least 2 people outside the tent at all times. No one goes anywhere alone. Rifles carried at all times, and if that bear comes within 50 yards, you haul us out of there immediately. Understood?" "Understood, base." They held a crew meeting inside the tent. Harold laid out the situation as clearly as he could. They were being stalked by a large, healthy polar bear. The bear had not shown direct aggression yet, but its behavior indicated interest. They could evacuate now, returning to Utqiagvik and losing the rest of the planned fishing season. Or they could stay, implement enhanced safety protocols, and hope the bear lost interest. "I'm not running from a bear," Robert said, surprising everyone. The young man had a reputation for being nervous, but there was steel in his voice now. "We've got rifles, we've got bear spray, we've got the protocols. I say we stay." David was less certain. "My family, if something happens to me..." "Something could happen to you driving to the grocery store in Anchorage," Jennifer pointed out. "There's risk in everything. The question is whether the risk is manageable." Thomas had been silent, his face thoughtful. Now he spoke. "In my culture, the bear is sacred. Nanook, we call it. The great wanderer. My people have lived alongside polar bears for thousands of years. We hunt them, yes, but with great respect. And we know that sometimes the bear decides to hunt us. When that happens, you have a choice. You can run, and maybe the bear lets you go. Or you can stand your ground, and maybe you earn the bear's respect." "That's a nice story," David said, "but I'm not in Inupiaq. I don't have thousands of years of tradition telling me how to deal with bears. I'm just a guy from Anchorage who wants to pay for his daughter's college." "Then go," Harold said quietly. "There's no shame in it. We can spare 1 snowmobile to get you back to Utqiagvik. The rest of us will stay and finish the job." David struggled visibly with the decision. Harold could see the war in his face, fear battling against pride, self-preservation against responsibility to the crew. Finally, David shook his head. "No, I stay. But if that bear comes at us, I'm shooting first and asking questions never." They spent the day implementing the new protocols. 2-person teams for everything. Rifles always loaded and ready. They strung a perimeter of bells and noisemakers around the camp, creating an early warning system. They cleared a line of sight all around the camp, moving equipment to eliminate blind spots. Thomas taught them some traditional Inupiaq deterrent methods, certain sounds and postures that might make them seem less like prey and more like a threat. The fishing that day was tense. Every sound made them jump. Every shadow could be the bear. But the hours passed without incident, and by evening they had pulled in a reasonable catch. That night they maintained triple watch, 3 people on duty at all times, positioned at different points around the tent. It was exhausting, cutting everyone's sleep to just a few hours, but it felt necessary. The bear returned at 2 in the morning. Jennifer saw it first. She was on watch at the north side of the tent when she caught movement in her peripheral vision. She turned, raising her rifle, and there it was, closer than before, maybe 50 yards out, standing upright on its hind legs, towering 8 or 9 feet tall, swaying slightly as it tested the air for scent. "Bear!" Jennifer shouted, her voice cutting through the Arctic night like a knife. Everyone erupted from the tent, scrambling for rifles and lights. Flashlight beams converged on the bear, catching it in a circle of illumination. For a moment the bear was frozen in the light, a creature of such raw physical power that it seemed almost unreal. Then it dropped to all fours and charged. 800 pounds of muscle and teeth and claws, accelerating across the ice with shocking speed. Polar bears can run at 25 miles per hour despite their size. From 50 yards, that meant the bear would cover the distance in approximately 4 seconds. Harold raised his rifle, finding the bear in his sights. His finger was on the trigger. 1 second, 2 seconds. Thomas was yelling something in Inupiaq, words that Harold didn't understand, but that carried the weight of authority and tradition. 3 seconds. Robert fired first, a sharp crack that echoed across the ice. The bullet struck the ice in front of the bear, kicking up a spray of frozen fragments. It was a warning shot, not aimed at the bear itself, but the message was clear. The bear slammed to a stop, maybe 25 yards from the tent. It stood there, breathing hard, vapor clouds erupting from its nostrils. The flashlights caught its eyes, which reflected back with an eerie green glow. "Hold your fire!" Harold shouted, his voice hoarse. The bear and the humans faced each other across 25 yards of ice. Neither side moved. The moment stretched, taut as a wire. Then slowly the bear backed away. 1 step, then another. It kept its eyes on them the entire time, never turning its back, moving with a kind of dignity. At 50 yards, it finally turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. They stood in the cold for a long time after the bear left, adrenaline making it impossible to feel the temperature. Harold's hands were shaking so badly he had to lower his rifle. "Why did it stop?" Robert whispered. "Because we stood our ground," Thomas said. "Because we made it understand that we weren't easy prey. A polar bear won't attack something that might hurt it unless it's desperate. That bear isn't desperate. Not yet." They maintained watch for the rest of the night, all 6 of them, no one even pretending to sleep. By morning they were exhausted, running on coffee and fear. The decision to evacuate was made over breakfast. None of them wanted to admit defeat, but the reality was clear. The bear had charged them. It had tested their defenses and found them sufficient, but that wouldn't last. Next time it might not stop. And if it didn't stop, at least some of them would likely die. They packed quickly and efficiently, loading the sleds with all their equipment and supplies. What they couldn't carry, they cached, burying it in a marked location to recover later. By 9 in the morning, they were ready to move. Marcus had arranged for additional support. A fish and wildlife team was deploying from Utqiagvik with helicopter support to track and, if necessary, relocate the bear. But the helicopter couldn't fly in the current weather conditions. High winds had returned, so they were on their own for the journey back. They formed a tight convoy, 3 snowmobiles pulling 3 sleds, all within sight of each other. Harold took point again, Jennifer in the middle, Thomas at the rear. The route back to Utqiagvik would take approximately 6 hours if they pushed hard and didn't encounter problems. The first hour passed without incident. The landscape looked different in daylight, the sun painting long shadows across the ice. Harold kept scanning the horizon, looking for any sign of the bear. He saw nothing, but that didn't mean the bear wasn't there. Polar bears are ambush hunters. They know how to use terrain, how to approach unseen. 2 hours in, Thomas's voice crackled over the radio. I've got tracks crossing behind us, fresh. Within the last 30 minutes, Harold's blood ran cold. How far behind? Maybe half a mile. The bear is following us. They stopped long enough to scan with binoculars. Thomas was right. Far behind them, moving at a steady pace, was a pale shape. The bear wasn't running, wasn't trying to catch them. It was just following, maintaining a steady distance, conserving energy. We could try to outrun it, Jennifer suggested. No, Harold said. If we burn through our fuel trying to outrun that bear and we break down or have mechanical trouble, we're dead. We keep to our planned speed, we maintain watch. We trust that the bear will eventually give up. It was the right decision strategically, but it meant spending the next 4 hours knowing they were being stalked by one of the most effective predators on the planet. Every time Harold looked back, the bear was there, a distant speck of white against white, tireless and patient. They made it to within 10 miles of Utqiagvik when disaster struck. David's snowmobile hit a pressure ridge hidden beneath fresh snow. It wasn't a large ridge, maybe 18 inches high, but he was moving fast enough that the impact was severe. The snowmobile bucked, throwing David and Robert, who was riding with him, forward onto the ice. The machine tipped sideways, its engine screaming, then died abruptly. Harold and Jennifer stopped immediately, circling back. Thomas brought his snowmobile alongside the crash site. David was sitting up, dazed but apparently unhurt. Robert was on his hands and knees, breathing hard. "Everyone okay?" Harold called out. "I think so," David said. "Just shaken up." They quickly assessed the damage to the snowmobile. The right ski was bent, the alignment knocked completely off. The machine wasn't going anywhere without significant repairs they couldn't make here. "We'll redistribute," Harold decided quickly. "Jennifer, David rides with you. Robert's already with Thomas. We'll tow the disabled sled with my machine. It'll slow us down, but we can make it." They were reorganizing, moving David's supplies to Jennifer's sled, when Thomas's voice cut through their radio chatter. "The bear is coming!" Fast. Harold spun around. The bear that had been maintaining a half-mile distance was now running, closing the gap with terrifying speed. It had seen the crash, had seen the moment of chaos and vulnerability, and had decided to take its chance. "Everyone on the machines now!" Harold roared. They scrambled, abandoning the supplies they'd been moving. Jennifer gunned her engine, David barely managing to get on behind her before she accelerated. Thomas was right behind, Robert clinging to his back. Harold had the disabled snowmobile's sled hitched to his machine, the tow line secured. The added weight would slow him significantly. He looked back. The bear was 200 yards away and closing. He twisted the throttle, and his snowmobile lurched forward, the extra weight of the tow making acceleration sluggish. The bear was 150 yards away. 100 yards. The snowmobile's engine was screaming, but Harold was only managing about 15 miles per hour with the extra load. The bear was faster. It was going to catch him. Jennifer and Thomas had realized what was happening. They circled back, trying to draw the bear's attention, firing their rifles into the air, shouting anything to distract it. But the bear had chosen its target. Harold was moving slower than the others, was pulling a load that made him vulnerable. The bear understood this with predatory clarity. 50 yards. Harold made a split-second decision. He released the tow line, cutting the disabled sled loose. His snowmobile surged forward, no longer burdened by the extra weight. The bear was 30 yards behind, close enough that Harold could hear it breathing, a rhythmic huff of exertion. 20 yards. Jennifer pulled alongside Harold, matching his speed. She had her rifle in one hand, steering with the other, a nearly impossible feat. She fired not at the bear, but near it, trying to scare it off. The bear didn't even flinch. 10 yards. Thomas appeared on Harold's other side, boxing him in protectively. He was shouting something, words lost in the roar of engines and wind. 5 yards. The bear made its final lunge, an explosion of power that launched 800 pounds of predator through the air. Its front paws stretched out, claws extended, mouth open, revealing rows of teeth designed for tearing flesh. Thomas swerved his snowmobile directly into the bear's path. The collision was horrific. 800 pounds of bear hit the snowmobile at full speed. The machine flipped, throwing Thomas and Robert through the air. The bear went down hard, rolling across the ice in a tumble of fur and snow. Harold managed to stop his machine, spinning it around. Jennifer was already off hers, running toward Thomas and Robert. David was frozen on the back of Jennifer's snowmobile, his face white with shock. The bear got up. It should have been injured, should have been stunned, but it rose to its feet with barely a pause, shaking its head as if clearing water from its ears. It was between Harold and the others, its attention now locked on Thomas, who was lying motionless on the ice 20 feet away. Harold raised his rifle, but he didn't have a clear shot. Thomas was directly in the line of fire. The bear took a step toward Thomas, then another. Robert was on his feet, miraculously unhurt from the crash. He had his rifle and raised it with shaking hands. "Don't move, Thomas. Just don't move." The bear was maybe 6 feet from Thomas now, leaning down, sniffing. Thomas's eyes were open. Harold could see that now, but he was following Robert's advice and staying absolutely still. Playing dead, the worst advice possible for a polar bear encounter, but now his only option. The bear opened its mouth. It was going to bite. It was going to take Thomas's head in its jaws and... Jennifer fired. The shot was perfect, threading between Thomas's prone body and the bear's lowered head, missing both by inches and striking the ice directly beneath the bear's nose. The impact sprayed ice and snow into the bear's face. The bear reared back, startled. Jennifer fired again and again, shots cracking across the ice, each one hitting closer to the bear. Not trying to hit it, that would just enrage it, but creating a wall of noise and impact that finally made the bear decide this prey was too dangerous. The bear turned and ran. It didn't walk away with dignity this time. It ran, moving at full speed until it disappeared over a pressure ridge maybe 400 yards away. They waited, frozen in place for what felt like hours, but was probably just minutes. Then Harold was running to Thomas, dropping to his knees beside him. "Thomas! Thomas! Can you hear me?" Thomas's eyes focused on Harold's face. He coughed, grimacing. "I'm alive. Feels like every rib is broken, but I'm alive." The inventory of injuries was substantial but not life-threatening. Thomas had cracked at least 3 ribs in the crash, possibly more. His left shoulder was dislocated. He had lacerations across his face and hands from being thrown across the ice. But he was conscious and breathing, and most importantly, he still had all his limbs and digits. Robert had gotten off incredibly lucky, a sprained wrist and bruises, but nothing serious. The crash should have killed both of them, but they had hit a patch of soft snow that had cushioned the impact just enough. They used Jennifer's snowmobile to create a makeshift ambulance, laying Thomas across the sled wrapped in every sleeping bag they had. Harold gave him 4 ibuprofen, the strongest painkiller they had, and Thomas took them without complaint. The journey back to Utqiagvik took another 90 minutes, with Harold driving while constantly scanning for any sign of the bear returning. They maintained radio contact with Marcus the entire time, and by the time they reached the outskirts of town, an ambulance was waiting. Thomas was taken to Samuel Simmons Memorial Hospital. Judith was on duty, and when she saw Harold walk in behind Thomas's gurney, her face went through a rapid sequence of emotions: relief that Harold was alive, concern for Thomas, anger that they had taken such risks, and finally, resignation. This was their life. This was what they did. Thomas spent 2 days in the hospital. His ribs would heal on their own with rest. The shoulder was relocated with what Thomas later described as the most painful experience of his life. The lacerations were cleaned and bandaged. He was given antibiotics to prevent infection and stronger painkillers that he reluctantly accepted. The rest of the crew were examined and treated for minor cold injuries, first-degree frostbite on several fingers and toes, dehydration, exhaustion. They were released the same day with instructions to rest and stay warm. The next morning, a fish and wildlife helicopter located the bear. It was 30 miles northeast of Utqiagvik, moving along the coast, hunting seals in leads between ice floes. The bear appeared healthy and uninjured. After lengthy discussions, the decision was made not to destroy or relocate it. The bear had been acting according to its nature. It had seen potential prey and had attempted to hunt. When the hunt proved too costly, it had given up. That was normal polar bear behavior. Harold, Jennifer, David and Robert returned to Drake Point 3 days later with a larger crew and helicopter support to recover their equipment. Everything they had cached was still there, untouched. They spent half a day loading everything onto sleds, then returned to Utqiagvik. The fishing season was over for them. Northern Lights Fisheries had lost approximately 3 weeks of potential fishing time and several $1,000s in equipment damage and lost opportunity. It was a significant hit, but not a fatal one. There would be next season. The media picked up the story. Polar bear stalks fishing crew for hours, attacks during evacuation. It was sensational enough to make regional news, but not quite dramatic enough for national coverage. A reporter from the Anchorage Daily News came up to interview the crew. Harold declined to be interviewed. He didn't want to be part of turning their experience into entertainment. Thomas was released from the hospital 5 days after the incident. Harold visited him at his home, a small house that Thomas shared with his elderly mother. She made them both coffee and left them alone in the living room. "You saved my life," Harold said. "That swerve, putting yourself between me and the bear." "Don't," Thomas interrupted. "We're crew, that's what crew does. You would have done the same." "I don't know if I would have," Harold said honestly. "I'd like to think I would, but in the moment, instinct takes over." "What you did was beyond instinct. It was choice." Thomas was quiet for a moment, cradling his coffee cup carefully with his injured shoulder immobilized in a sling. "My grandfather used to say that the measure of a man is what he does when there's no time to think. When your body acts before your mind catches up, that's when you find out who you really are." "Then you're a good man, Thomas." "Better than most." A week after the incident, Marcus called a meeting at the Northern Lights Fisheries office. The entire crew was there, including Thomas, who was still moving stiffly but healing well. Marcus laid out the situation plainly. The company had taken a financial hit, but was stable. They had recovered most of their equipment. The catch they had brought back before the evacuation had been enough to cover costs and provide minimal profit. Next season, they would fish again, but with enhanced safety protocols and a larger crew. "What I want to know," Marcus said, looking at each of them in turn, "is whether you're willing to go back out there." Robert answered first. "Yes, absolutely yes." David was slower to respond, but finally nodded. "My daughters need college money, so yes," Jennifer shrugged. "It's what I do." "Bear or no bear, I'll be back." Thomas's answer surprised no one. "The ice is my home." "One bear doesn't change that." Harold was the last to answer. They all looked at him, waiting. He thought about Judith, about their children, about how he had almost died out there, about how Thomas had almost died saving him, about the arbitrary nature of survival. "The bear let us live," Harold said finally. "Maybe it wasn't hungry enough. Maybe we fought back hard enough. Maybe it was just luck, but we lived. And I think we earned the right to go back out there, with respect for what's out there, but without fear. So yes, I'll be back next season." They raised their coffee cups in a toast. 6 people who had faced something primal and survived, who had learned that the line between life and death in the Arctic is measured in seconds and decisions, and who had chosen to walk that line again. But that wasn't the end of the story. It was November 4th, 2024, just 3 weeks after the crew had returned from Drake Point. Harold was at home, enjoying a rare period of rest before the next round of preparations began. He was sitting in his living room, reading a book about Arctic exploration, when his phone rang. It was Marcus, and his voice was tight with tension. "Harold, we have a situation. Tom Riley's boat went down yesterday off Point Hope. They were doing late-season fishing, pushing the limits. 4 crew members, 2 made it to shore. 1 is still missing. And Tom..." Marcus paused. "Tom's dead. Polar bear attack." Harold felt his blood turn to ice. Tom Riley was an old friend, someone Harold had fished with years ago before Tom started his own operation further north. Good man, experienced, careful. What happened? From what the survivors are saying, their boat struck ice, started taking on water. They abandoned ship, tried to make it to shore on foot. They were on the ice for maybe 6 hours before the bear found them. It went for Tom. By the time the others scared it off, he was gone. This is the 2nd attack this season, Harold. Fish and Wildlife is organizing a major response. The next day, Harold found himself in a meeting with Fish and Wildlife officers, the Alaska State Troopers, and representatives from several fishing operations. The tone was grim. A senior Fish and Wildlife officer named Catherine Morrison led the meeting. She was in her 50s, with short grey hair and the kind of competent authority that came from decades in the field. "We're dealing with an unusually aggressive season for polar bear interactions," she began, displaying a map on a screen that showed the locations of every documented bear sighting and incident over the past 3 months. There were dozens of marks. "Climate factors are creating conditions where bears are staying closer to human activity longer than normal. Food sources are scarce. Ice is forming later. We're seeing behaviors that are outside typical parameters." "What's the solution?" someone asked. "There isn't one," Catherine said bluntly. "Not a permanent one. We can increase patrols. We can require more stringent safety protocols. We can hazing certain bears that are getting too comfortable around humans. But ultimately, you're operating in their territory. They're endangered, which means we can't simply eliminate every bear that poses a potential threat. You need to understand and accept the risk." After the meeting, Harold approached Catherine privately. "The bear that stalked my crew," Harold said. "Has it been seen since?" Catherine consulted her notes. "Several sightings over the past 3 weeks, moving along the coastline northeast of Utqiagvik. It hasn't approached any human activity since your incident, appears to have learned that humans are dangerous." "And the bear that killed Tom Riley?" "Different animal. Smaller, female, possibly with cubs, though we haven't confirmed that. She's been relocated about 200 miles north. Whether she'll stay there is another question." Harold wanted to ask if it was all worth it. The fishing, the risk, the constant threat. But he already knew the answer. It had to be worth it, because otherwise, what was the point of any of this? But the story still wasn't over. Couldn't be over, because the Arctic doesn't allow for neat conclusions. November 5th, 2024, dawned with temperatures at -28 degrees Fahrenheit. Harold woke early, as was his habit, and made coffee while Judith slept. He sat at their kitchen table, watching the sky gradually lighten, thinking about Tom Riley, about the bear, about how fragile the barrier was between life and death up here. His phone rang at 7:30. It was Marcus again. "You need to come to the office." "Now." "What's wrong?" "Just come." Harold dressed quickly, left a note for Judith, and drove to the Northern Lights Fisheries office. When he arrived, he found Marcus, Thomas, Jennifer, and several other crew members gathered around the radio, all with grave expressions. "What's happening?" Harold asked. Marcus gestured to the radio. "We're getting reports of an emergency at a fishing operation at Nuvuk Point. That's about 15 miles northeast of here. 3-man crew. One of them isn't responding. The other 2 are calling for help." As Harold listened, the situation became clear. A crew of 3. Harold didn't know them personally, but Marcus identified them as members of a smaller operation called Arctic Harvest Fisheries. Had been fishing at Nuvuk Point for about a week. This morning, 2 of them had gone inland about a quarter mile to check some equipment they had cached. When they returned, the 3rd crew member, a 67-year-old named Harold Collins, the same first name as Harold Benjamin Collins but no relation, was missing. They had found blood on the ice, drag marks, a shredded jacket, and tracks, large tracks, polar bear tracks. "They're requesting immediate assistance," Marcus said. "Fish and Wildlife has a helicopter on the way, but weather is marginal. They might not be able to fly. We're closer than anyone else." Harold looked at Thomas, then Jennifer. He saw his own thoughts reflected in their faces. This was the nightmare scenario. Someone was injured, possibly dead, possibly being dragged across the ice by a polar bear, and they were the closest people who could help. "We go," Harold said. "Now." Within 30 minutes, they had assembled a response team. Harold, Thomas, Jennifer, and Robert. David was in Anchorage visiting his family. They loaded 2 snowmobiles with emergency medical supplies, rifles, and radio equipment. Marcus stayed behind to coordinate with Fish and Wildlife and maintain communication. The journey to Nuvuk Point took 45 minutes, pushing the snowmobiles as hard as they dared on uncertain ice. The 2 surviving crew members from Arctic Harvest Fisheries, whose names were Greg Saunders and Mike Patterson, were waiting for them, both visibly shaken. Greg was in his late 30s, lean and sunburned despite the cold. Mike was older, maybe 55, with a thick beard crusted with ice. Both men looked like they had seen death, and Harold realized they probably had. "Show us," Harold said. They walked to the fishing site, maybe 100 yards from the main camp. The scene was immediately recognizable to anyone who had spent time in bear country. The ice was churned up, blood sprayed in dark patterns that looked black against the white. The shredded jacket was there, torn to pieces, with massive claw marks visible in the fabric, and the drag marks leading away northeast, a trail of disrupted snow and occasional blood spots. "Tell us exactly what happened," Thomas said, his voice calm despite the situation. Greg spoke, his voice shaking. Harold Collins, our guy, he was checking the fishing lines. Mike and I had gone to check the equipment cache. We were gone maybe 45 minutes. When we came back," he stopped, swallowing hard. "We heard sounds, snarling, tearing. By the time we got there, the bear was dragging Harold toward a pressure ridge. We fired shots, trying to scare it off. The bear dropped Harold and came at us. We ran. We're not proud of it, but we ran." "You did the right thing," Harold said. "Staying would have just meant more deaths." "We came back an hour later," Mike added. "Harold was gone. Just his jacket left. We followed the drag marks for maybe a quarter mile, then lost them in the pressure ridges. The bear took him into the broken ice. Thomas was studying the tracks, reading the story written in snow and blood. Big male. Maybe the same one that stalked us. Maybe different. Impossible to tell. Attack happened approximately 2 hours ago, based on how the blood is frozen. If Harold Collins survived the initial attack, and that's a big if, he'd be suffering from massive trauma, hypothermia, and shock. In these temperatures, without proper clothing, survival time is maybe 3 to 4 hours. "So we tracked the bear," Jennifer said. "Try to find Harold." "And if we find the bear?" Robert asked. No one answered that question directly. They all knew what finding the bear would mean. If the bear was still with Harold Collins, still feeding, they would have to kill it. Not scare it away, not hazing it, but kill it. And if they killed a polar bear, an endangered species, without following proper protocols, there would be legal consequences. But Harold Collins had been their colleague, part of the fishing community, and he deserved whatever chance they could give him. They split into two teams. Harold Benjamin Collins and Thomas would follow the drag marks on foot, carrying rifles and moving carefully through the pressure ridges. Jennifer and Robert would maintain a position with the snowmobiles, providing backup and communication. Greg and Mike would stay at the camp, monitoring the radio. The tracking was slow, dangerous work. The pressure ridges created a maze of ice walls and hidden crevasses, places where the ice had buckled and broken, creating terrain that was treacherous even without the threat of a bear. Thomas led, moving with the patient care of someone who understood that hurry could be fatal. They found more blood, spatters and smears that created a trail through the ice. They found what might have been pieces of clothing. And they found places where the bear had stopped, set down its burden, possibly fed. "He's dead," Harold said quietly. "Collins is dead." "Probably," Thomas agreed, "but we keep looking. His family deserves to know what happened, deserves to recover his body." They pressed on, following the trail deeper into the pressure ridges. The walls of ice rose around them, 15 and 20 feet tall in places, creating narrow passages that blocked sight lines and created 1,000 hiding places for an ambush predator. Then they heard it. A sound that made Harold's skin crawl, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the ice walls. Thomas raised his rifle, scanning. Harold did the same, his heart hammering. The bear emerged from behind an ice wall 20 feet away. It was massive, even larger than Harold had estimated, easily 9 feet long and probably close to 900 pounds. Its fur was yellowed with age and matted with what Harold realized with horror was blood. The bear stood on its hind legs, rising to its full height, easily 10 feet tall. Its mouth opened, revealing teeth stained red. It roared, a sound so deep and primal that Harold felt it in his chest like a physical blow. "Don't shoot unless it charges," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the situation. "If it charges from this distance, we'll be dead before we can fire," Harold pointed out. "Then we better hope it doesn't charge." The bear dropped to all fours. It took a step toward them, then another. Its eyes were locked on them with an intensity that Harold had never seen in any animal. This wasn't curiosity. This was possession, territory, a predator defending its kill. Behind the bear, partially hidden by an ice wall, Harold could see what he knew was Harold Collins's body, or what remained of it. The bear had been feeding. "We can't recover him," Harold said quietly, "not without killing the bear." Thomas was silent for a long moment, his rifle steady despite the bear's proximity. "No, we can't." They backed away slowly, maintaining eye contact with the bear, but not challenging it directly. The bear watched them go but didn't follow. It had its kill. That was enough. When they were far enough away that they could speak without the bear hearing, Harold used his radio to contact Jennifer. "We found Collins. He's dead. The bear is still there. We can't recover the body." Jennifer's response was immediate. "Fish and Wildlife is on scene. Helicopter just landed. They're deploying a team." By the time Harold and Thomas made their way back to the main camp, a full Fish and Wildlife response was underway. Catherine Morrison was there, along with 3 other officers, all armed with rifles and tranquilizer guns. Harold gave them the location of the bear and the body. Catherine's expression was grim. "We'll handle it from here." "You've done enough. More than enough." "What happens now?" Harold asked. "We'll try to dart the bear, relocate it at least 200 miles from here. We'll recover Mr. Collins's body and return it to his family. And we'll add another incident to our growing list of polar bear attacks. Will it ever stop? Harold asked. These attacks? Catherine looked at him with eyes that had seen too much death. No. As long as humans operate in polar bear territory, there will be attacks. It's the price of being here. The bears aren't going to leave, so we learn to coexist or we leave. Those are the only choices. D. The Fish and Wildlife team spent 6 hours tracking and darting the bear. They finally managed to dart it with a tranquilizer dose sufficient to sedate a horse. The bear fought the drugs for nearly 20 minutes before finally going down. They airlifted it to a location far north, well away from human activity, though everyone knew the bear would eventually return. Harold Collins's body was recovered, what the bear had left of it. The details were not released to the media, but Harold Benjamin Collins heard through the community network that it had been brutal. Collins had not died quickly. He had likely been alive when the bear began feeding. The funeral was held 5 days later in Utqiagvik. Harold Benjamin Collins attended, sitting in the back of the small church, listening to Collins' daughter speak about her father. He had been a good man by all accounts. Hard-working, devoted to his family, passionate about fishing. He had survived 43 years in the Arctic, only to die in his 67th year at the jaws of a polar bear. After the funeral, Judith took Harold's hand as they walked to their car. "You're going to tell me you're done," she said, "that this is it. No more fishing, no more Arctic, no more risking your life." Harold was quiet for a long moment. "I wish I could. I wish I was that smart. But you're not." "No, I'm not. This is what I do, Judith. It's who I am. And I know that sounds stupid and stubborn and probably suicidal, but I can't explain it any better than that." Judith squeezed his hand. "I know. I've always known. I just wish the Arctic was less cruel about teaching its lessons." December arrived, with its promise of darkness. The sun stopped rising above the horizon, replaced by a perpetual twilight that lasted only a few hours each day. The polar night had begun, a period of darkness that would last until late January. Northern Lights Fisheries suspended operations for the winter. The ice was too unstable, the darkness too complete, the bears too active. They would resume in late January if conditions improved. Harold spent the dark months at home, doing maintenance work on equipment, planning for next season, trying not to think too much about Harold Collins or Tom Riley or all the other people who had died, doing exactly what Harold did. Thomas healed. By Christmas, his ribs had knitted back together, his shoulder had regained most of its range of motion, and he was talking about going back out on the ice come January. Robert took a trip back to Boston to visit his mother, but returned after 2 weeks, telling everyone who would listen that he couldn't stand the crowds and the noise of the city. The Arctic had gotten into his blood, as it did for some people. Jennifer spent the winter training for a marathon she planned to run in Anchorage in March. She ran laps around Utqiagvik in the darkness, her headlamp creating a small sphere of light in the endless night. David flew down to Anchorage and spent Christmas with his family. When he returned in January, he showed everyone pictures of his daughter's opening presents, their faces lit with joy that made the hardship and risk feel momentarily worthwhile. On January 20th, 2025, the sun returned, rising above the horizon for the first time in months. It was a brief appearance, barely an hour, but the entire town celebrated. The worst of the darkness was over. Spring, such as it was in the Arctic, was coming. Northern Lights Fisheries began preparing for the next season. New equipment was purchased to replace what had been damaged or destroyed. New safety protocols were implemented, incorporating lessons learned from the previous season's incidents. Additional crew members were recruited, bringing the total operation up to 12 people who would work in rotating shifts. A ceremony was held at the office to honor Tom Riley and Harold Collins. A plaque was mounted on the wall listing their names and dates, a memorial to those who had died doing the work that needed doing. Marcus gave a brief speech about sacrifice and risk and the peculiar stubbornness of people who chose to make their lives in impossible places. By early February, they were ready to return to the ice. The crew had grown to include several new members, people who understood the risks but were willing to take them anyway. The bears were still out there, still hunting, still dangerous, but the fish were also out there, and the fishing had to be done. Harold stood at the warehouse on the morning of February 15th, watching his crew load equipment onto sleds. Thomas was there, moving a little stiffly, but otherwise fine. Jennifer was checking snowmobiles with her characteristic intensity. Robert was cracking nervous jokes that were actually less nervous than before. David was going through his checklist with meticulous care. Marcus walked up beside Harold, watching the activity with the practiced eye of someone who had seen this scene play out dozens of times. "You know," Marcus said, "we could hire younger crews, people who don't have families waiting for them, people who don't have as much to lose." "We could," Harold agreed. "But would they be as careful, as experienced? Would they understand that the ice doesn't forgive mistakes?" Probably not. They stood in comfortable silence, two men who had spent enough time together that words were often unnecessary. "The bear's still out there," Marcus said. "The one that stalked you. Fish and Wildlife tracks it. It's been seen along the coast, hunting seals, healthy and active." "I know." "Doesn't bother you?" Harold thought about it. "Everything up here can kill you. The cold, the ice, the water, the bears. You can't live your life afraid of every threat. You just have to be careful, respectful, and maybe a little bit lucky. And if your luck runs out..." Harold turned to look at Marcus. "Then I guess I'll have died doing what I chose to do, in a place I chose to be. There are worse ways to go." By mid-morning, the convoy was ready to depart. 3 snowmobiles, 3 sleds, 6 crew members. They would fish for 2 weeks, then return for resupply, then head out again. The season would run through April, weather and bears permitting. Judith came to the warehouse to see Harold off. She didn't usually do that. Goodbyes were harder than hellos. But today, she made an exception. They stood apart from the others, hands clasped, not saying much. "Be careful," she said. "I will. More careful than usual. I promise. The bears, I know. We'll be careful about the bears." She reached up and touched his face, her hand warm despite the cold. "Come home to me. Always have. Always will." They kissed briefly, a promise and a hope and a prayer all wrapped into one gesture. Then Harold turned and climbed onto his snowmobile, Thomas settling in beside him, and they drove away into the Arctic morning. The landscape opened up before them, vast and white and beautiful in its hostility. Somewhere out there, polar bears hunted across the ice, driven by hunger and instinct, completely indifferent to human plans and protocols. The ice groaned and shifted beneath them, a living thing that might hold or might break without warning. The temperature hung at -35, cold enough to kill in minutes for anyone unprepared. But Harold had spent 43 years learning how to survive in this place, and he had no intention of stopping now. The Arctic demanded respect, demanded sacrifice, demanded constant vigilance, but it also provided a kind of meaning that couldn't be found anywhere else, a clarity that came from knowing that every day was a choice to engage with forces larger and older than human civilization. The convoy moved northeast, following the coast, heading toward fishing grounds that might be productive or might be empty, where bears might be waiting or might be miles away. There was no certainty, no guarantee. There was only the ice, the work, and the quiet dignity of people choosing to do difficult things in impossible places. And somewhere far to the north, a massive polar bear raised its head from a seal kill, testing the air for scent, aware on some instinctual level that humans were moving across the ice. The bear considered this information with the calculus of a perfect predator, weighing risk against reward, hunger against caution. For now, the bear returned to its meal. The humans could wait, but the bear would remember. Bears always remembered. And the cycle continued, as it had for thousands of years and would for thousands more, humans and bears, both trying to survive in a place that actively worked against survival, both unwilling to surrender the ice to the other, locked in an eternal negotiation written in tracks and blood and the unforgiving mathematics of predator and prey. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the ice in shades of gold and purple, beautiful enough to make you forget, at least for a moment, that beauty and danger were often the same thing in the Arctic. Harold drove on, his crew around him, moving deeper into the territory of bears and ice and 1,000 different ways to die, choosing this life over safety, choosing meaning over comfort, choosing the Arctic over everything else. Because in the end, some people were built for impossible places, and Harold Benjamin Collins, at 67 years old, with a wife waiting for him at home and children scattered across the continent and every reason to choose an easier path, was one of those people. The snowmobile's engine thrummed beneath him, a heartbeat of machinery in a wilderness that had no use for machines. The radio crackled with routine check-ins. The temperature continued to drop as the sun descended, and far behind them, Utqiagvik disappeared into the distance, a small cluster of lights against the vast darkness, a reminder that civilization was always just a few miles away, but might as well be 1,000 for all the protection it could offer. This was the Arctic. This was the life Harold had chosen, and he wouldn't trade it for anything, even knowing what he knew, even having seen what he'd seen, even understanding that one day the ice or the cold or the bears might win. But not today. Today they would fish, tomorrow they would fish again, and the day after that, and the day after that, until the season ended or their luck ran out or something else made the decision for them. The ice stretched ahead, endless and waiting, and Harold Collins drove into it without hesitation, carrying with him the accumulated weight of 43 years of Arctic experience and the simple, stubborn conviction that this was where he belonged, whatever the cost. And if the bears were out there, and they certainly were, then so be it. This was their territory as much as anyone's, and sharing it meant accepting the occasional tribute. Harold had been lucky so far, Thomas had been lucky, the crew had been lucky. But luck, like ice, could only be trusted so far. Beyond that was faith. Faith in preparation, in caution, in the bonds between crew members who had learned to trust each other with their lives. Faith that knowledge and respect and vigilance might be enough to keep them alive one more day, one more season, one more year. The Arctic didn't care about faith. The Arctic didn't care about anything human. But Harold cared, and Thomas cared, and every person on that convoy cared, and sometimes caring was enough. Sometimes it had to be enough. The convoy moved on, 3 machines and 6 humans, tiny against the immensity of ice and sky, moving toward an uncertain future with a confidence born from nothing more than having survived this long. And somewhere in the distance, beyond sight and hearing, the bear that had stalked them remembered the sounds and smells of humans, remembered that they had fought back, remembered that they were dangerous, but also potentially rewarding prey. The bear filed this information away, in whatever passed for memory in a predator's brain, storing it for future reference. The bear would hunt seals, the bear would hunt anything it could catch. And if the opportunity presented itself, if the humans made a mistake or grew complacent or simply had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, the bear would hunt them too. This was the contract, written in ice and blood, the understanding that governed life in the Arctic. Everything hunts, everything is hunted, and survival belongs to whoever makes the fewest mistakes. Harold understood this contract. He had signed it 43 years ago when he first decided to make his living from the Arctic's grudging bounty. He renewed that signature every time he went out on the ice, every time he chose this life over any easier alternative. The price of that choice was vigilance, discomfort, and the ever-present risk of a violent death. The reward was meaning, purpose, and the particular satisfaction that came from doing difficult things well. Was it worth it? Harold had stopped asking that question years ago. Worth was irrelevant. This was simply what he did. This was who he was. The convoy reached their destination as the brief Arctic day transitioned to twilight. They began the familiar process of setting up camp, drilling fishing holes, establishing their perimeter. The work was hard and cold and necessary, and they did it with the practiced efficiency of people who had done it 100 times before. By evening, they had a functioning camp. Lines were in the water. Watch was established. The portable heater made the tent almost comfortable. Jennifer made coffee that was strong enough to strip paint, and they passed cups around, grateful for the warmth. "Here's to another season," Robert said, raising his cup in a toast. They all raised their cups. Another season. And outside the ice groaned and cracked with its eternal restlessness, and the temperature dropped toward -40, and somewhere in the vast darkness, bears moved across the frozen ocean, hunting and hungry and utterly indifferent to human hopes and fears, and the fragile tents that represented civilization's temporary foothold in their territory. This was the Arctic, this was the life, and tomorrow they would wake up and do it all again, because this was what they had chosen, this was what they knew, this was home, terrible and beautiful in equal measure, demanding everything and promising nothing except the opportunity to prove, one more time, that humans could survive in places that clearly didn't want them. The story ends here, not because the story is over. Stories in the Arctic never truly end, but because this is where we must leave Harold and his crew, moving forward into an uncertain future, carrying with them the lessons of those who didn't survive, honoring their memory with caution and respect, and the determination to do the work that needs doing. The ice will hold or it won't. The bears will attack or they won't. The weather will cooperate or it won't. These things are beyond human control. What can be controlled is preparation, vigilance, and the choice to face the Arctic with eyes open and an understanding that survival is never guaranteed, but is always worth fighting for. And in homes throughout Utqiagvik, families waited for their loved ones to return from the ice, hoping that this season would be like the last, that luck would hold, that the Arctic would be merciful. But mercy was not the Arctic's nature. The Arctic simply was, beautiful, terrible, indifferent, eternal, and Harold Collins, at 67 years old, was part of that eternal cycle now, another human trying to extract a living from ice and water and fish, another temporary presence in a landscape that would outlast human civilization itself. This was the Arctic, this was the life, and this was enough. The next stories. The last light of Hudson Bay. The wind that came off Hudson Bay in late August carried with it the smell of ice and ancient cold, a harbinger of the winter that would soon lock the subarctic landscape in its frozen grip for 8 months of darkness and temperatures that could kill exposed flesh in minutes. John Stanton stood on the weathered deck of the research cabin, 43 years old, his beard shot through with premature grey, watching the sun sink toward the horizon in a blaze of orange and purple that seemed to set the tundra itself on fire. He had been coming to Churchill, Manitoba, for 17 years, ever since completing his doctorate in polar ecology at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and the sight of that sun dropping toward the edge of the world still took his breath away every single time. Behind him, through the cabin's salt-stained windows, he could see his wife Rebecca moving in the kitchen area, her silhouette backlit by the warm glow of the propane lamps they used to supplement the solar panels that powered the remote station. Rebecca Stanton, 41, had the lean, weather-hardened build of someone who had spent 2 decades doing fieldwork in some of the harshest environments on Earth. She had met John at a conference in Anchorage in 2009, where she had been presenting her groundbreaking research on climate change impacts on Arctic fox populations, and he had been immediately drawn to her fierce intelligence and the way her eyes lit up when she talked about the fragile ecosystems of the far north. They had married 18 months later in a small ceremony in Fairbanks, with their closest friends and colleagues in attendance, and had spent the intervening years conducting joint research projects that had earned them both considerable respect in the tight-knit world of polar scientists. This year's expedition was different from their usual summer surveys. They had received emergency funding from the Canadian Wildlife Service and the Polar Bears International Research Consortium to investigate troubling reports of polar bear behavior changes in the Churchill region. The bears were coming to shore earlier than normal, driven by catastrophically early sea ice melt that had left them unable to hunt seals during their normal feeding season on the frozen Hudson Bay. Rangers from the Wapusk National Park, conservation officers from Manitoba Sustainable Development, and Inuit hunters from nearby communities had all reported the same disturbing pattern. Bears that were desperately thin, aggressive beyond normal parameters, and willing to approach human settlements in ways that violated generations of observed behavior. 3 incidents in June and July had resulted in property damage, and one had nearly ended in tragedy when a juvenile male bear had torn through the wall of a weather station, sending 2 technicians scrambling for safety. The bear had been successfully hazed away with rubber bullets and pyrotechnics, but the message was clear. The bears were starving and they were running out of options. The Stantons had assembled a team of 6 additional researchers and support personnel for what they had planned as a 6-week intensive study of the bears' behavior patterns, nutritional status, and ranging habits during this critical pre-freeze period. The research cabin they had chosen was designated CWS-17 in the Canadian Wildlife Service database, located approximately 47 kilometers northeast of Churchill proper, accessible only by helicopter or, in winter, by snow machine across the frozen bay. The cabin itself was a sturdy structure built in 1987, renovated in 2012, measuring approximately 9 meters by 12 meters, with reinforced walls constructed of 2x6 studs, double insulated with spray foam and faced with weather-resistant composite panels. The windows were small and positioned high on the walls, a design feature intended to prevent polar bears from seeing inside and becoming curious about the cabin's contents. The door was heavy-gauge steel set in a reinforced frame with multiple deadbolts and a steel bar that could be dropped into place across the interior. According to the maintenance logs, the cabin had withstood numerous bear encounters over its 37 years of service without a breach. The research team had arrived on August 19, 2024, transported in 2 Bell 206 helicopter flights from Churchill's small airport. The first flight had brought John and Rebecca, along with Dr. Marcus Chen, a wildlife veterinarian from the University of Manitoba who specialized in immobilization protocols and health assessments of large carnivores. Marcus was 36, originally from Vancouver, with a wife and infant son back in Winnipeg, who he called every evening via satellite phone when the weather permitted. He had worked with polar bears for 8 years and had personally handled more than 200 individual bears, drawing blood samples, fitting GPS collars, and conducting health examinations that provided crucial data about how the population was responding to rapidly changing environmental conditions. Marcus had a methodical approach to his work that John appreciated, and a dry sense of humor that made even the most tedious aspects of data collection bearable. He kept a photograph of his family pinned to the wall above his bunk, and John had noticed him staring at it with an expression of longing during the quiet evening hours. The second helicopter flight had brought Dr. Sarah Whitehorse, a traditional knowledge expert and conservation biologist who had been born and raised in the nearby community of Aviat, Nunavut. Sarah was 48, a member of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, and she brought to the project a perspective that John knew was invaluable. She understood polar bears not just as research subjects, but as Nanook, a creature that occupied a place of profound significance in Inuit cosmology and traditional practices. Her grandfather had been a legendary hunter who had killed 37 polar bears in his lifetime using traditional methods, and Sarah had grown up listening to his stories about bear behavior, about how to read their intentions, about the signs that indicated when a bear had shifted from cautious curiosity to predatory focus. She had warned John, during their planning meetings in Winnipeg back in July, that the bears they would encounter this season would be different, desperate, dangerous in ways that the literature and the textbooks could not fully capture. John had listened politely and had assured her that they would follow all safety protocols, but privately he had attributed some of her concerns to cultural storytelling traditions rather than empirical observation. He was beginning to wonder if that had been a mistake. Also on the second flight had been Thomas Richardson, a field technician from Parks Canada who had worked in Churchill for 6 seasons and knew the terrain better than anyone else on the team. Thomas was 29, from Thunder Bay, Ontario, a former hockey player whose knee injury had ended his semi-professional career and sent him looking for a different kind of challenge. He had found it in the Arctic, where his physical strength and unflappable temperament made him ideal for the demanding work of deploying trail cameras, maintaining equipment in brutal weather, and serving as an extra set of eyes during surveys. Thomas carried a Remington 870 shotgun loaded with cracker shells and rubber slugs whenever he ventured outside the cabin, and he had a permit for the Winchester .338 rifle that was locked in a case inside the cabin, to be used only as a last resort if a bear posed an imminent threat to human life. He took his responsibilities as the team's primary safety officer seriously, perhaps too seriously, Rebecca sometimes thought. He had a tendency to see threats everywhere, to interpret every distant movement on the tundra as a potential bear approach. But John appreciated his vigilance. The final 2 team members were Dr. Jennifer Walsh and her assistant, David Park. Jennifer was 52, a climate scientist from McGill University whose focus was on sea ice dynamics and their cascading effects on Arctic ecosystems. She had published more than 80 peer-reviewed papers and had been lead author on 3 major IPCC climate assessment reports. Her presence on the team was something of a coup, as she was in high demand for research projects around the world, but she had expressed particular interest in documenting the connection between ice-free seasons and polar bear condition. David was her graduate student, 26, originally from Seoul, South Korea, working on his PhD in atmospheric science. This was his first extended period in the Arctic, and Jennifer had told John privately that she had some concerns about how he would handle the isolation and the 24-hour daylight that still persisted this far north in late August. But David had proven himself to be a quick learner and enthusiastic about even the most mundane data collection tasks. Together, the 8 researchers had spent the first 5 days establishing their research protocols. They had deployed 40 trail cameras in a grid pattern extending 15 kilometers from the cabin, each camera equipped with infrared sensors that would capture images of any bears moving through the area. They had set up a small weather station that recorded temperature, wind speed, precipitation, and barometric pressure at 15-minute intervals, data that would be correlated with bear movement patterns. Marcus had organized his veterinary supplies and prepared his immobilization drugs, carefully calculating dosages based on the estimated weights of the bears they might encounter. Sarah had spent time walking the immediate area around the cabin, noting the terrain features, the locations of escape routes, the places where a bear might approach undetected. She had pointed out to John a series of parallel scratches on a large boulder approximately 100 meters from the cabin, marks that she identified as a signpost left by a male bear, a way of communicating his presence to other bears in the area. The scratches were recent, she said, probably within the last week. The bear had been big, she added, based on the height of the marks. Very big. Thomas had conducted safety drills with the entire team, making sure everyone knew the location of the bear bangers, the air horns, the pepper spray canisters. He had established a protocol that no one was to step outside the cabin without first scanning the area carefully and informing at least one other person. He had tested the satellite phone and the VHF radio that connected them to the Churchill Ranger Station, confirming that they had reliable communications. He had inspected the cabin's emergency supplies, the first aid kits, the emergency beacon, the flare gun, the week's worth of emergency rations stored in sealed containers. Everything had checked out. They were as prepared as it was possible to be. The research itself had been productive. They had documented 17 individual polar bears in the first 5 days, identifying each animal by the unique pattern of scars, whisker spots, and body proportions that served as a fingerprint. Marcus had successfully immobilized and collared 3 adult females, drawing blood samples and conducting physical examinations that confirmed what they had feared. These bears were in poor condition, with reduced fat stores and signs of nutritional stress. One female had been so thin that her ribs and hip bones were clearly visible beneath her fur, a shocking sight in an animal that should have been robust and well-fed after a summer of hunting seals on the ice. But the ice had broken up in early June, a full month earlier than historical averages, and the bears had been forced to shore before they had accumulated the fat reserves they needed to survive the ice-free season. They were now in a waiting period, burning through their stored energy while they anticipated the freeze-up that would allow them to return to the ice and resume hunting. Except this year, the forecast models that Jennifer was reviewing suggested that the freeze-up might be delayed until mid-November, possibly even December. The bears might not make it that long. On the evening of August 24th, as the sun finally dipped below the horizon for the first time since they had arrived, casting the tundra into a twilight that felt alien after days of endless daylight, the team had gathered around the cabin's wooden table for dinner. Rebecca had prepared a meal of dehydrated chili, rehydrated with water from their filtration system, served with crackers and chunks of cheese from their supplies. It was simple fare, but after a long day of hiking through wet tundra, reviewing camera trap images, and entering data into their laptops, it tasted like a feast. The conversation had been relaxed, ranging from discussion of the day's observations to playful arguments about which research projects deserved more funding, to Thomas's story about an encounter with a bear in the Churchill dump 2 years earlier that had resulted in him driving a Parks Canada truck in reverse for 3 kilometers, while the bear loped after him with what Thomas swore was an expression of pure mischief on its face. Sarah had been quieter than usual, and John had noticed her glancing frequently at the windows, even though it was impossible to see anything outside except darkness. When he asked if something was troubling her, she had hesitated before speaking. She told the group that earlier in the day, while she had been checking one of the trail cameras, she had found tracks of an adult male bear, tracks that were notable for their size. The front paw print had measured 32 centimeters across, which suggested a bear that likely weighed between 600 and 700 kilograms, a truly massive animal. The tracks had been heading directly toward the cabin, she said, although they had veered off about 200 meters away and continued northeast along the shoreline. What concerned her was not just the size of the tracks, but their freshness and the pattern of the stride. The bear had been moving deliberately, pausing frequently, as if it were investigating its surroundings carefully. This was not the behavior of a bear simply passing through the area. This was the behavior of a bear that was actively surveying its territory and taking note of anything unusual, including the presence of humans and their structures. Thomas had asked if she thought the bear was a threat, and Sarah had chosen her words carefully. All polar bears should be considered a potential threat, she said, but male bears in poor condition during the ice-free season warranted extra caution. Male bears did not hibernate during the ice-free period like pregnant females did. They remained active, and when food became scarce, they became opportunistic. They would eat anything they could find: vegetation, bird eggs, carrion, garbage, and yes, under the right circumstances, humans. There had been multiple documented cases of polar bears killing and consuming humans, she reminded them. In 1983, 2 people had been killed by a bear near Churchill. In 2011, a bear had killed a young man in his tent on the outskirts of town. The bears were not mindless killing machines, but they were pragmatic predators that made cost-benefit calculations about every potential food source they encountered. A starving bear might calculate that the risk of approaching a human dwelling was worth the potential reward. Marcus had pointed out that the cabin was secure and that they had deterrents available. Sarah had nodded but had added that they should be especially vigilant over the next few days. She had a feeling, she said, and John had seen Thomas exchange a glance with Jennifer, a look that suggested skepticism about feelings and intuitions. But John had learned to trust Sarah's instincts. She had a connection to this land and these animals that came from generations of accumulated knowledge, and dismissing her concerns would be foolish. The conversation had moved on to other topics, and eventually the team had begun preparing for bed. David had volunteered to take the first watch, a practice they had established where one person would remain awake until midnight, primarily to monitor the weather station data and respond to any radio calls, but also to maintain a basic level of awareness about the cabin's surroundings. John had taken his usual spot on the lower bunk nearest the door, with Rebecca above him. Marcus and Thomas shared the bunk across from them. Sarah had a single bunk near the back wall, and Jennifer and David had the remaining bunks. The cabin had slowly filled with the sounds of people settling into sleep, the rustle of sleeping bags, the creak of bunk frames, someone's soft snoring, the whisper of wind against the cabin walls. John had lain awake for a while, his mind reviewing the day's data, thinking about the paper he would write when they returned to civilization, already composing paragraphs in his head about the correlations between sea ice extent and polar bear body condition indices. Eventually, his thoughts had grown fuzzy and indistinct, and he had slipped into sleep. He woke at 2:47 a.m., according to the luminous dial of his watch, woken by a sound that his sleeping brain had initially tried to incorporate into a dream. But as consciousness returned, he recognized the sound for what it was, a low, rumbling vocalization, something between a growl and a moan coming from outside the cabin. His first thought was that it was the wind, which could produce remarkably lifelike sounds as it moved around structures and through rocks. But there was a quality to this sound that was unmistakably organic, unmistakably alive. John slipped out of his sleeping bag as quietly as he could and padded in his sock feet toward the window nearest the door. Thomas was already there, he realized, standing motionless in the darkness, his breath fogging slightly in the cool air. The temperature inside the cabin had dropped to around 14 degrees Celsius, comfortable for sleeping but cool enough that John felt goosebumps rise on his arms. Thomas held up a hand in a gesture that meant, "Wait, listen." John stood beside him, straining his ears. For a long moment, there was nothing except the wind and the distant sound of waves lapping against the rocky shore. Then it came again. That low, rumbling vocalization, closer now, definitely coming from an animal, definitely coming from something large. Thomas whispered a single word. "Bear." John felt his heart rate accelerate, felt the sudden dump of adrenaline into his bloodstream that made his hands tingle and his vision sharpen. He glanced around the cabin and saw that others were waking, alerted by some instinct that registered the change in the room's atmosphere. Rebecca was sitting up in her bunk, her eyes finding John in the darkness. Marcus was awake, silently reaching for his glasses. Sarah was already up, moving toward the window with the fluid silence of someone who had grown up learning to move without disturbing the land. The sound came again, and this time it was accompanied by another sound, the scrape of something against the cabin's exterior wall, a grinding, scratching sound that sent a primitive spike of fear through John's nervous system. Thomas moved to the equipment area, where they kept the deterrents, and came back with the air horn in one hand and the bear banger launcher in the other. He positioned himself near the door, waiting. Sarah had her face close to the window, peering out into the darkness. The moon was a thin crescent, providing almost no illumination, but the stars were brilliant in the clear Arctic sky, and there was a faint glow on the northern horizon that might have been the beginning of the aurora, or simply the ambient light that never fully vanished this far north in late summer. Sarah stood absolutely still for what felt like an eternity, then stepped back from the window and turned to face the group. "It's a male," she said quietly. "Very large. He's investigating the cabin." John asked if she could see what condition the bear was in, and Sarah shook her head. "Too dark. But he's moving slowly, deliberately, taking his time." Thomas asked if she thought they should try to haze the bear away, and Sarah considered the question. "Not yet. He hasn't shown aggression. He's just investigating. If we scare him now, he might leave, but he might also learn that the cabin produces loud noises and bright lights, which means there's something here worth investigating further. Sometimes it's better to let them satisfy their curiosity and move on." They waited, listening to the sounds of the bear moving around the cabin. He seemed to be circling the structure, pausing occasionally, presumably to sniff at windows or walls. John could hear the bear's breathing now, a sound like bellows, powerful and rhythmic. The bear paused at the door, and John heard a different sound. The bear's nose working against the steel, snuffling, gathering information through his extraordinary sense of smell. Polar bears could smell a seal breathing hole from more than a kilometer away. The bear would certainly be able to smell the humans inside the cabin, could probably distinguish between the different people, could smell the food in their supplies, could smell their fear. The bear hit the door with its paw, a massive impact that rattled the entire frame and caused everyone in the cabin to flinch. It was a testing blow, John realized. The bear trying to understand what this structure was, whether it was solid or hollow, whether it could be breached. Thomas raised the air horn, his finger on the trigger, but Sarah motioned for him to wait. The bear hit the door again, harder this time, and John heard the steel groan slightly. The door was solid, he reminded himself. The door was designed to withstand polar bears, but hearing the raw power of that impact, understanding that a living creature was applying that force, was different from reading specifications in a maintenance manual. The bear moved away from the door, and they heard him at the corner of the cabin, then along the back wall. Rebecca had climbed down from her bunk and was standing next to John, her hand finding his in the darkness. Her palm was cool and slightly damp. John squeezed her hand, trying to project a confidence he did not entirely feel. Jennifer whispered, "How long will he stay?" Sarah answered, "Until he decides there's nothing here worth his time. Could be 5 minutes, could be an hour." David asked, "Has anyone ever been killed in one of these research cabins?" The question hung in the air, and no one answered it, which was answer enough. John knew the statistics. Fatal polar bear attacks were rare, but not unheard of. The literature documented approximately 73 attacks between 1870 and 2014, resulting in 20 deaths and 63 injuries. But those numbers were probably underestimates, especially for attacks that occurred in remote areas or in earlier historical periods when record-keeping was sporadic. The bears were apex predators, the largest land carnivores on Earth, and they had no natural fear of humans. The only reason attacks were not more common was that polar bears and humans rarely occupied the same spaces, and when they did, humans usually had the tools and knowledge to avoid conflict. The bear continued his circuit of the cabin, and John began to relax slightly, thinking that perhaps Sarah was right, that the bear would satisfy his curiosity and move on. But then the sounds stopped. Complete silence descended, broken only by the wind and the distant waves. Thomas whispered, "Where did he go?" Sarah pressed her face to the window again, scanning what she could see of the surrounding area. "I can't see him. He might have moved off, or he might be staying still, watching the cabin." They waited. 5 minutes passed. 10. The tension in the cabin was almost unbearable, every person straining to hear any sound that would indicate the bear's location. John found himself holding his breath, then consciously forcing himself to breathe normally. The silence stretched on. 15 minutes after the sounds had stopped, Sarah said, "I think he's gone, but we should maintain watch for the rest of the night. He could come back." Thomas agreed, and they organized a rotation. Thomas would watch until 4 a.m., then Marcus would take over until 6, when the sun would be rising and visibility would improve. Everyone else tried to return to sleep, but John noticed that most people remained in their sleeping bags with their eyes open, staring at the ceiling or the walls, listening. John eventually drifted into a light doze, but woke frequently, his mind convinced it heard sounds that probably were not there. When dawn finally began to lighten the sky, around 5:30 a.m., he gave up on sleep and got up to join Marcus at the window. Marcus looked tired, dark circles under his eyes, visible even in the dim light. "Quiet?" John asked. Marcus nodded. "Nothing since about 3. I think he really did leave." When the sun had risen enough to provide good visibility, Thomas and Sarah volunteered to go outside and check for tracks and any damage to the cabin. They armed themselves with the air horn, bear spray, and the shotgun loaded with deterrent rounds, then carefully opened the door and stepped out. John watched through the window as they moved cautiously around the building, Thomas with the shotgun at the ready, Sarah examining the ground. They were outside for about 20 minutes before returning. Sarah's expression was grim as she entered the cabin and gathered the team around the table. She had taken photographs with her phone, and she now scrolled through them, showing the team what they had found. The tracks confirmed what they had suspected. A large adult male, probably the same bear whose tracks she had found the previous day. The tracks completely circled the cabin, and at several points there were clear marks where the bear had stood on his hind legs and placed his front paws against the walls, reaching heights of more than 2.5 meters. There were claw marks on the steel door, deep gouges that had scraped away the paint and scored the metal itself. The bear had tested the windows, had pushed against the walls, had investigated every aspect of the structure. But what concerned Sarah most, she said, was not what the bear had done, but what the tracks suggested about his intentions. The bear had not simply wandered past the cabin and gotten curious. He had approached from downwind, from a direction that would have allowed him to smell the cabin and its occupants while remaining undetected. He had circled the structure methodically, testing it, looking for weaknesses, and then he had left, but not because he had been frightened away or had lost interest. The tracks showed that he had walked away at a steady pace, pausing once to look back at the cabin, then continuing northeast along the coast in the same direction he had been traveling before. "He knows we're here," Sarah said. "He knows this cabin exists. He knows there are people inside, and he's filed that information away. He'll remember it. And if he gets desperate enough, if he gets hungry enough, he might come back." Thomas asked if they should consider evacuating, returning to Churchill early. John felt the question like a physical blow. They had been here less than a week. They had so much work still to do. The data they could collect during this critical period could inform polar bear conservation efforts for years to come. But he also understood that safety had to be the first priority. Sarah looked at John, seeming to understand his internal conflict. "We don't need to leave right now," she said, "but we need to be smarter. No one goes outside alone. We keep deterrence within arm's reach at all times. We maintain watch through the night. And if that bear comes back, if he shows any escalation in his behavior, any sign that he's moving from curious to predatory, then yes, we call for evacuation immediately." John nodded, and the rest of the team murmured their agreement. Jennifer pointed out that they had a satellite phone connection to the Churchill Ranger Station and that a helicopter could reach them in approximately 40 minutes in good weather. They had options. They were not trapped. The team spent August 25th in a state of heightened alertness. They continued their work, reviewing trail camera images, processing blood samples, updating their database of identified bears, but everything was done with one eye on the surroundings, one ear listening for sounds that did not belong. Thomas instituted a new protocol. Every 2 hours, someone would conduct a visual sweep of the area around the cabin using binoculars, looking for any sign of bears approaching. The cabin had binoculars stationed at each window now, and they had moved the shotgun from its storage case to a position near the door where it could be accessed in seconds. The day was overcast, with low clouds rolling in from the bay, bringing a cold mist that reduced visibility to a few hundred meters. The wind picked up in the afternoon, gusting to 40 kilometers per hour, and Jennifer noted that the barometric pressure was dropping, suggesting that a storm system might be moving in. The temperature hovered around 8 degrees Celsius, cold enough that everyone wore insulated jackets when they went outside to service the weather station or retrieve data from the nearest trail cameras. Rebecca had gone out with Marcus at 2 p.m. to check the camera approximately 500 meters south of the cabin along the shoreline. They had been gone for 35 minutes, which was longer than expected, and John was beginning to feel anxious when he saw them returning at a fast walk, almost a jog. When they came through the door, both of them were breathing hard, and Marcus immediately went to the satellite phone. Rebecca explained that they had reviewed the camera's images and had found something disturbing. The camera had captured the large male bear at 11:37 a.m., just a few hours earlier. The bear had approached the camera directly, had spent several minutes investigating it, had even stood on his hind legs to sniff the device where it was mounted in a tree. The camera's automatic flash had fired when the bear triggered the sensor at close range, and Rebecca showed the resulting images to the group. They were startling in their clarity and detail. The bear's face filled the frame, his dark eyes reflecting the camera flash with an eerie green glow, his mouth slightly open showing his yellowed teeth, his black nose dominating the center of the image. It was possible to see individual whiskers, the texture of his fur, the power in his neck and shoulders. But what had prompted their rapid return was not the images themselves, but what Marcus had noticed in the data log. The camera had been triggered 73 times in the past 24 hours. All but 6 of those triggers had been caused by the same bear, the large male, returning to the camera again and again. The timestamps showed a pattern. The bear would leave, then return anywhere from 20 minutes to 2 hours later, investigate the camera again, then leave once more. The most recent trigger had been at 1:52 p.m., less than 10 minutes before Rebecca and Marcus had arrived. Sarah studied the images carefully, zooming in on the bear's face, examining his eyes and body posture. "He's fixated," she said finally. "He's identified our equipment as a sign of human presence, and he's trying to understand it. This is problem-solving behavior. This bear is intelligent and he's curious, and he's starting to form associations between our scent and these structures and cameras." David asked if they should remove the cameras, eliminate the things that were drawing the bear's attention. Sarah shook her head. "Too late for that. He already knows where the cabin is. Taking the cameras down won't change that, and it would mean someone would have to go out there and potentially encounter him." Thomas suggested that they should call the ranger station and report the situation, get their assessment. Marcus was already on the satellite phone, and after a brief conversation, he handed the phone to John. On the other end of the line was Doug Morrison, the senior wildlife ranger for the Churchill area, a man with 32 years of experience managing human-bear conflicts. John explained the situation, the nighttime visit, the tracks around the cabin, the camera data showing repeated returns. Doug listened without interrupting, then asked several pointed questions about the bear's size, behavior, and body condition. John answered as best he could, describing the claw marks on the door, the methodical way the bear had investigated the cabin, Sarah's assessment that the bear was showing intelligent problem-solving behavior. Doug was quiet for a moment, and John could hear him typing on a keyboard, probably pulling up records or consulting reference materials. Finally, Doug spoke. "John, I'm going to be straight with you. What you're describing is consistent with a pre-attack pattern. It's not guaranteed that this bear is planning to attack, but the behavioral markers are there. A large male, in poor condition based on the general population status, showing persistent interest in a human structure, returning repeatedly, testing for weaknesses. This is exactly the kind of scenario we warn people about." John felt his stomach drop. "What do you recommend?" Doug said. "Standard protocol would be to bring you out immediately. Get a helicopter up there and evacuate the site. But the weather is turning bad. We've got a low-pressure system moving in, and the forecast is calling for high winds and poor visibility starting around 8 p.m. tonight, lasting through tomorrow morning. Flying a helicopter in those conditions would be risky." John asked, "So what are our options?" Doug laid them out. Option 1, they could try to evacuate now, before the weather deteriorated, but that would mean scrambling to prepare for departure and potentially having a helicopter arrive at the cabin during the narrow window before conditions became unsuitable. Option 2, they could shelter in place, maintain their safety protocols, and wait for the weather to clear, at which point an evacuation could be conducted safely. Option 3, they could try to haze the bear away using deterrents, make the area around the cabin unpleasant enough that the bear would choose to move to a different location. Doug added, "If you choose option 2 or 3, I want you to understand the risks. That bear has already demonstrated that he's willing to approach the cabin. If he's hungry enough, if he decides that the potential reward outweighs the risk, he could try to breach the structure. The cabin is solid, and it's designed to keep bears out, but I won't lie to you. A determined polar bear is incredibly powerful. If he really commits to getting inside, he might succeed." John thanked Doug for his candor and said he needed to discuss the options with his team. Doug said he would stand by and wait for John's decision. John relayed the conversation to the group, and they began to debate their choices. Jennifer strongly advocated for immediate evacuation, pointing out that their lives were more important than any research data. David agreed with her. Marcus was torn, acknowledging the risks, but also noting that they had not actually been threatened yet, that all the bear had done was investigate the cabin, which was normal behavior. Thomas leaned toward evacuation, saying that his responsibility was to keep everyone safe, and the safest option was to leave. Rebecca remained quiet, and when John asked her opinion, she sighed. "I think we should stay. If we leave now, in a rush, in marginal weather, we could have an accident. The helicopter could have problems. And for what? Because a bear walked around our cabin. We knew there would be bears. We prepared for this." Sarah spoke last. "I've lived with Nanook my entire life. I've seen them in every season, in every kind of condition, and I'm telling you that this bear is different. The way he's behaving, the persistence, the intelligence he's showing, this is not a bear that's just passing through. This is a bear that's made a decision. I don't know what that decision is yet, but I think we need to take it seriously." She paused, then added, "That said, I also think the cabin is secure. If we're vigilant, if we follow protocols, I think we can wait out the weather and evacuate tomorrow when conditions improve." The group voted, and the decision was 5-3 in favor of staying. Jennifer, David, and Thomas voted to leave. John, Rebecca, Marcus, Sarah, and Jennifer voted to stay. It was not unanimous, and John felt the weight of being responsible for a decision that some team members disagreed with. He called Doug back and informed him of their choice. Doug acknowledged the decision and said he would have a helicopter on standby starting first thing tomorrow morning, ready to fly as soon as the weather cleared. He also said he would notify the RCMP detachment in Churchill about the situation, just as a precaution. As John ended the call, he looked around the cabin at his team, at these people he had brought to this remote place, and he felt a cold knot of anxiety in his gut. He told himself they had made the right decision, that they were prepared, that everything would be fine. But Sarah's words kept echoing in his mind. This is a bear that's made a decision. The afternoon wore on, and the weather continued to deteriorate. The wind increased to sustained speeds of 50 kilometers per hour, with gusts that John estimated were reaching 70 or 80. The mist turned to rain, a cold, wind-driven rain that lashed against the cabin's walls and created a constant roar that made conversation difficult. Visibility dropped to less than 100 meters, and the world outside the windows became a grey blur. The storm had arrived earlier than forecast, and it was worse than expected. At 6 p.m., they ate dinner, another meal of rehydrated food, but no one had much appetite. The conversation was muted, people speaking in low tones, the atmosphere in the cabin tense, despite attempts to lighten the mood. Thomas made a joke about how they would all have a great story to tell when they got back to civilization, about how they had faced down a polar bear and lived to publish their findings. A few people smiled, but the humor felt forced. At 7 p.m., Sarah was at the south-facing window, conducting the scheduled visual sweep of the area, when she suddenly froze. She raised the binoculars to her eyes, adjusted the focus, then lowered them slowly. "He's back," she said quietly. Everyone moved to the windows. Through the rain and mist, barely visible, was the shape of the bear. He was approximately 200 meters from the cabin, positioned on a slight rise in the terrain, and he was sitting motionless, facing the structure. Even at this distance, even in these conditions, his size was apparent. He was massive, his head alone seemingly the size of a barrel, his shoulders humped with muscle, his overall appearance suggesting an animal that would weigh somewhere between 650 and 700 kilograms. The bear sat and watched the cabin. 5 minutes passed. 10. He did not move. The rain soaked his fur, and John could see water streaming off the bear's back, but the bear seemed indifferent to the weather. His focus was absolute. Thomas asked, "Should we try to scare him off?" Sarah said, "In this weather with this wind, he probably won't hear an air horn, and he definitely won't care about a bear banger. We'd just be wasting ammunition." Marcus said, "Maybe he'll just watch for a while, and then leave like he did last night." But even as Marcus spoke, the bear stood up, shifted from sitting to standing on all 4 legs, and began walking toward the cabin. His pace was unhurried, deliberate, the gait of an animal that had no fear and no uncertainty about his intentions. He was not charging, he was simply approaching, and there was something profoundly unsettling about the calm purposefulness of his movement. Thomas grabbed the shotgun and racked around into the chamber, one of the rubber slugs that were designed to hit a bear hard enough to cause pain and send a clear message that the area was dangerous. Sarah grabbed the bear banger launcher. John found himself holding his breath as the bear closed the distance. 150 meters, 100 meters, 75 meters. At 50 meters, Thomas opened the door slightly, just enough to create a gap, and Sarah fired the bear banger. The explosive projectile shot out of the launcher with a loud bang and streaked toward the bear, detonating in the air about 10 meters above and in front of him with a brilliant flash and a loud explosion that should have sent any normal bear running. The bear stopped, looked up at the smoke and dissipating flash, then looked back at the cabin. He seemed to consider what had just happened. Then he started walking toward the cabin again. Thomas fired the shotgun, aiming for the bear's front shoulder. The rubber slug flew straight and struck the bear with a meaty thud that was audible even over the wind. The bear flinched, shook his head, stopped walking. He turned his body slightly, presenting his profile to the cabin rather than facing it directly. For a moment, John thought the deterrence had worked, that the bear was going to retreat. But then the bear turned back to face the cabin, and John saw something in the bear's eyes, even at this distance, that made his blood turn cold. It was a look of calculation, of assessment. The bear had just learned that the cabin could produce loud noises and physical impacts, and he had absorbed that information and decided it was not enough to deter him. The bear continued his approach. Thomas fired again, another rubber slug, this one striking the bear in the shoulder. The bear barely reacted. Sarah fired another bear banger, and this one exploded even closer to the bear, close enough that the flash surely must have been painful to his eyes. The bear stopped, backed up 3 steps, then resumed his approach. At 20 meters, Thomas slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolts. He turned to the group, his face pale. "The deterrents aren't working." "He's not afraid of us." Sarah said, "Get away from the door." Everyone moved to the back of the cabin. They retreated from the door area, and John could hear the bear now, could hear his footsteps, the sound of his breathing. The bear reached the door and began pushing against it, testing it, just as he had done the night before. But this time the pushing became hitting, became the bear throwing his weight against the door in a regular, rhythmic pattern. Boom, boom, boom. Each impact shook the cabin. Dust fell from the ceiling beams. Rebecca clutched John's arm, her fingernails digging into his skin through his jacket. David had his hands over his ears, his eyes wide with terror. Jennifer had backed into the corner, as far from the door as she could get. Marcus had his satellite phone out, was trying to dial, but his hands were shaking so badly he kept hitting wrong keys. The bear paused in his assault on the door, and they heard him moving around the cabin again. He was at the window now, the small window nearest the door, and John heard a different sound, the crack of wood, the groan of the window frame being stressed beyond its design parameters. Sarah yelled, "He's trying to get in through the window!" Thomas had the shotgun loaded now with the lethal rounds, the .30-06 slugs that were meant to kill a bear, not just deter it. He positioned himself facing the window, the shotgun at his shoulder, his finger on the trigger. If he gets through, I'm shooting to kill. The window frame splintered with a sharp crack, and suddenly the bear's paw was coming through, reaching into the cabin, the massive appendage sweeping back and forth, claws extended. The claws were easily 10 centimeters long, black and curved like scythes. Thomas fired the shotgun, the blast deafening in the enclosed space, and the slug struck the bear's paw. John saw blood explode, saw the bear jerk his paw back through the window. They heard the bear roar, a sound unlike anything John had ever heard, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, primal and full of rage and pain. Then the bear hit the wall with his full body weight, and John felt the cabin shift, felt the floor tilt slightly. The bear hit the wall again, and this time John heard the crack of studs breaking, heard the sound of the cabin's structure beginning to fail. The bear was not trying to come through the door or the window now. He was trying to knock the entire wall down. Marcus had the satellite phone to his ear, was screaming into it. "We need help! The bear is breaking into the cabin. We need evacuation now." John could not hear the response, but he saw Marcus's face go slack with despair. Marcus lowered the phone and said, "They can't fly in this weather. The helicopter can't take off. We're on our own." The bear hit the wall again, and this time a section of the interior paneling broke loose and fell inward, revealing the insulation beneath, and beyond that, a glimpse of the bear's face through the gap, his dark eye visible for a split second before he moved to position himself for another impact. Thomas fired the shotgun through the gap, heard the slug strike the bear somewhere, heard another roar. Sarah grabbed John's arm and pulled him toward the back of the cabin. "We need to prepare to abandon the structure. If he gets in here, we're dead. Our only chance is to get outside, get away from the cabin, find shelter somewhere else." John's mind reeled. Go outside, into a storm, with an injured, enraged polar bear between them and any possible escape route. But as the bear hit the wall again and more of the structure gave way, he realized Sarah was right. Staying in the cabin meant being trapped, meant giving the bear time to breach the walls and come in after them. At least outside, they would have space to run, room to maneuver. Thomas fired again, then again, emptying the shotgun's magazine. He fumbled for more shells, dropped them, picked them up with shaking hands. The bear roared again, and this time the sound was so close, so loud, that John felt it in his chest like a physical force. Rebecca was crying, tears streaming down her face, and she grabbed John and kissed him hard on the mouth, a desperate, terrified kiss that tasted like salt and fear. "I love you," she said. "I love you so much." John said, "We're going to be okay. We're going to get through this." But even as he said the words, he did not believe them. The bear hit the wall again, and this time a large section of the wall collapsed inward, creating a gap approximately 1 meter wide. Cold air and rain flooded into the cabin, and through the gap, John could see the bear, could see his full form for the first time at close range. The bear was monstrous, larger than John's worst imagination, his fur soaked and matted with rain and blood from the gunshot wounds, his eyes fixed on the humans inside the cabin with an intensity that spoke of hunger and desperation and a will that would not be denied. Thomas fired at the bear's head, missed, fired again and struck the bear in the neck. The bear roared and backed away from the gap, and Thomas screamed, "Go!" Everyone out the back, move! They ran for the rear door, a smaller secondary exit that was rarely used, and Thomas was fumbling with the locks when the bear came through the gap in the wall. He was too large to fit easily, but he forced his way through, his shoulders scraping against the broken edges of the wall, his breath coming in explosive huffs. David screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure terror. The bear's eyes locked onto David, and the bear lunged. Marcus threw himself between David and the bear, swinging a chair he had grabbed, hitting the bear across the snout. The chair shattered on impact, but it bought them seconds. Thomas got the back door open, and they poured out into the storm, into the wind and rain and darkness. John grabbed Rebecca's hand and ran, not knowing where he was running, just knowing they needed distance from the cabin, needed to get away from the bear. Behind them, he heard Thomas firing the shotgun, heard Marcus shouting, heard the bear roaring. He heard Sarah yelling for everyone to stay together, to not scatter. They ran approximately 30 meters before Rebecca stumbled and fell, pulling John down with her. He landed hard on the wet tundra, felt rocks dig into his ribs. He rolled over and looked back at the cabin. In the dim light, he could see the bear emerging from the back door, could see Thomas backing away from him, still firing the shotgun, even though it was surely empty by now. The bear, focused on Thomas, began stalking toward him with that same deliberate, unhurried gait. Thomas threw the shotgun at the bear and turned to run, but the bear was faster. The bear closed the distance in 3 bounds, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. The bear struck Thomas from behind, his paw hitting Thomas's back with enough force to send him flying forward. Thomas hit the ground and tried to crawl, tried to get away, but the bear was on him. John could not watch, but could not look away. He saw the bear bite down on Thomas's shoulder, saw the bear shake his head like a dog with a toy, saw Thomas's body go limp. The sound was terrible, worse than the roaring, worse than the gunshots. The sound of Thomas's brief cut-off scream, the sound of his body hitting the ground, the sound of the bear feeding. Sarah was yelling, "Run! Keep running, don't stop!" Jennifer was sobbing, hyperventilating. David was on his hands and knees, vomiting. Marcus was standing motionless, staring at the scene, his face a mask of shock. The bear paused in his attack on Thomas, raised his head, and looked at the group. His muzzle was dark with blood. He seemed to be assessing, calculating whether to pursue the others or to stay with the prey he had already taken down. For a moment that felt like eternity. John stared into the bear's eyes across those 30 meters of darkness and rain, and he understood with absolute clarity that this animal was not a metaphor, not a symbol of nature's power or climate change, or any of the abstract concepts he had spent his career studying. This was a living being motivated by hunger and the desperate need to survive, and they were food. The bear made his decision. He lowered his head back to Thomas and resumed feeding. Sarah hissed, "Go! Move!" while he's distracted. They moved away from the cabin, staying low, trying to be silent despite the storm. John kept looking back, expecting to see the bear pursuing them, but the bear remained focused on Thomas. They walked for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 or 40 minutes, putting as much distance between themselves and the cabin as they could. The terrain was treacherous in the darkness, full of rocks and hidden depressions and patches of standing water. Jennifer fell twice, gashing her knee the second time. David was limping, apparently having twisted his ankle. Finally, Sarah called a halt. They had reached an area of slightly higher ground, where a series of large boulders provided some minimal shelter from the wind. The group huddled together behind the largest boulder, shivering violently, soaked to the skin, their teeth chattering so hard they could barely speak. Marcus had the satellite phone, and he tried to call the ranger station again, but the storm was interfering with the signal. He kept trying over and over, while the rest of them pressed together for warmth. John held Rebecca, felt her body shaking against his, whether from cold or fear or shock, he could not tell. Probably all three. Sarah said, "We need to think. We can't stay here all night. The temperature is dropping. If we don't find better shelter, we'll die of exposure before morning." Jennifer said, "What about the cabin? Can we go back when the bear leaves?" Sarah shook her head. "The cabin is compromised. The walls are breached. Even if the bear leaves, the structure won't keep us warm, and he might not leave. He's found a food source there. He'll stay as long as there's anything to eat." David said, his voice breaking, "Are we going to die out here?" No one answered him. Marcus finally got a connection on the satellite phone and spoke urgently to whoever was on the other end. John could hear only Marcus's side of the conversation. Yes, bear attack. 1 casualty, confirmed dead. 7 survivors, but we're exposed. No shelter. You have to get us out of here. I don't care about the weather. We'll die if you don't come. Marcus listened, and John saw his expression harden. I understand the risks, but we're going to die otherwise. Please, you have to try. Marcus ended the call and looked at the group. They're going to try to get a helicopter to us at first light. If the winds drop below 80 kilometers per hour, they'll risk it. They're also dispatching a ground team with snow machines from Churchill, but it will take them several hours to reach us, and that's if they can find us in this weather. Rebecca asked, What do we do until then? Sarah said, We keep moving. Not far, just enough to stay warm. We find the best shelter we can. We wait for dawn. The next several hours were among the worst of John's life. They walked slowly through the storm, trying to keep their bearings, trying to avoid getting separated. Sarah led, using her intimate knowledge of this landscape to guide them generally southward, toward Churchill, even though she acknowledged that they could not hope to walk the 47 kilometers back to town in these conditions. They were just trying to stay alive until rescue arrived. They found a depression in the terrain that provided some shelter, and they stopped there for a while, huddling together in a tight group. The wind was brutal, sucking the heat from their bodies faster than they could generate it. John felt his fingers and toes going numb, felt the cold creeping up his limbs. He knew the signs of hypothermia, the shivering, the confusion, the desperate sleepiness. He fought to stay alert, to keep moving, to keep talking to Rebecca and making sure she stayed conscious. David stopped responding at around 3 a.m. Marcus shook him, slapped his face, but David's eyes remained closed, his body limp. Marcus checked for a pulse, found one, but it was weak. He's hypothermic. Severe. If we don't get him warm soon, he's going to die. They tried to shelter David as much as possible, putting him in the center of the group, covering him with their own bodies. But they were all cold, all approaching the point where their bodies could no longer maintain core temperature. John felt his own thoughts beginning to slow, felt the seductive pull of sleep. Rebecca whispered in his ear, John, stay with me. Don't fall asleep. We're going to make it. Just a few more hours. John forced his eyes open, forced himself to focus. The sky to the east was beginning to lighten, the faintest suggestion of grey against black. Dawn was coming, if they could just hold on a little longer. At 5:47 a.m., according to the timestamp later recorded in official reports, the storm began to break. The winds dropped from sustained gale force to merely strong, and the rain decreased to a drizzle. The clouds started to fracture, allowing glimpses of the sky above. Marcus got the satellite phone working again and confirmed that the helicopter was preparing to launch from Churchill. The helicopter arrived at 6:23 a.m., the sound of its rotors cutting through the morning air like a promise of salvation. The pilot, a veteran named Carl Jensen who had flown in these conditions for 26 years, set the aircraft down on the most level ground he could find approximately 50 meters from where the group was sheltering. 2 paramedics jumped out, carrying medical gear, and ran toward the group. John remembered very little of the helicopter ride back to Churchill. He remembered the warmth of the helicopter's heater, the most wonderful sensation he had ever experienced. He remembered the paramedics working on David, shouting medical jargon, starting an IV, wrapping him in heat-reflective blankets. He remembered looking out the window and seeing the cabin below, seeing the bear still there, lying in the ruins of the structure, visible as a dark shape against the lighter ground. They landed at the Churchill Health Center, where additional medical personnel were waiting. John and Rebecca were treated for moderate hypothermia, receiving warm intravenous fluids and being placed in heated rooms with monitoring equipment. Marcus had severe frostbite on 3 fingers of his left hand. Jennifer had a concussion from one of her falls, in addition to hypothermia. Sarah was in the best condition of any of them, having fared better due to her years of experience in extreme weather. David was critical, placed in intensive care, his body temperature having dropped to 28.3 degrees Celsius, well into the severe hypothermia range. The RCMP arrived to take statements. John told them everything he could remember, from the first nighttime visit by the bear, to the attack on the cabin, to Thomas's death, to their flight into the storm. Rebecca corroborated his account. Sarah provided additional details about the bear's behavior, explaining to the officers that this was not typical bear behavior, that something had driven this animal to take extreme risks and show extreme persistence. The RCMP organized a recovery team to retrieve Thomas's body and to assess the cabin. The team included wildlife rangers, RCMP officers, and a veterinarian with authorization to destroy the bear if he was still in the area. The team flew to the site at 11 a.m., and what they found confirmed everyone's worst fears. The bear had remained at the cabin and had consumed most of Thomas's body. The cabin itself was destroyed, the walls breached in multiple places, the interior ransacked. The bear was located approximately 100 meters from the cabin, and based on his behavior when the helicopter approached, showing no fear, actually moving toward the helicopter, the decision was made to destroy him. A ranger named Patricia Woods, an expert marksman, fired 3 shots from a .375 H&H rifle, and the bear went down after the 3rd shot. The bear's body was retrieved and transported to a veterinary pathology facility in Winnipeg for necropsy. The examination revealed a male polar bear weighing 638 kilograms, approximately 15 to 17 years old, based on tooth wear and size. The bear was in extremely poor condition, with body fat stores at approximately 6% of total body weight, compared to the normal 25 to 30% for a healthy bear. The bear had multiple old injuries, including a partially healed fracture of the left hind leg and evidence of past infections. Most significantly, the necropsy revealed that the bear's teeth were extensively damaged, with multiple broken and worn teeth that would have made it extremely difficult for him to hunt and eat his normal prey. The examining veterinarian concluded that this was a bear that was probably unable to hunt seals effectively, that was starving, and that had turned to humans out of sheer desperation. The investigation by Manitoba Sustainable Development and Environment Canada concluded that the attack was a result of multiple converging factors: climate change leading to early sea ice breakup and extended ice-free periods, a bear that was physically compromised and unable to hunt effectively, and the presence of humans in an area that the bear had identified as part of his territory. The report made several recommendations, including more aggressive monitoring of bear conditions during ice-free periods, consideration of supplemental feeding programs for bears in critical condition, and potential restrictions on human activities in prime polar bear habitat during high-risk periods. Thomas Richardson's body was returned to his family in Thunder Bay, and a memorial service was held on September 7, 2024. More than 300 people attended, including many of Thomas's colleagues from Parks Canada and the broader conservation community. Thomas was remembered as someone who had loved the wilderness, who had understood the risks of the work he did, and who had died trying to protect his teammates. His parents established a scholarship in his name for students pursuing careers in wildlife management. David Park survived, though he lost 4 toes on his left foot to frostbite and spent 3 weeks in the hospital recovering from hypothermia and its complications. He eventually returned to South Korea and completed his PhD remotely, never returning to the Arctic. He told an interviewer years later that he still had nightmares about the bear, about the sound of Thomas's scream, about the feeling of his body shutting down from the cold. Jennifer Walsh and Marcus Chen both recovered physically within a few months, though Marcus lost the tips of 2 fingers to frostbite. Both of them continued their research careers, but neither of them ever returned to Churchill or worked with polar bears again. Jennifer shifted her focus to Antarctic research, studying emperor penguins and Southern Ocean ecosystems. Marcus moved into small animal veterinary practice, working at a clinic in suburban Toronto. Sarah Whitehorse returned to her community in Aviat and continued her work as a traditional knowledge expert and conservation advocate. She became one of the leading voices calling for a more holistic approach to polar bear management, one that incorporated both scientific data and indigenous wisdom about animal behavior and ecosystem changes. She spoke frequently about the attack, using it as a case study for what happens when humans fail to respect the power and unpredictability of wildlife, especially wildlife under extreme environmental stress. She died in 2029 from cancer, leaving behind a legacy of research papers, policy contributions, and a generation of younger Indigenous scientists who she had mentored. John and Rebecca Stanton struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder for years after the attack. Both of them had recurring nightmares, panic attacks, and difficulties with crowds or enclosed spaces. They underwent counseling, both individually and as a couple, and slowly worked through their trauma. They never returned to polar bear research. John eventually transitioned to a desk job with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in Washington, D.C., focusing on policy analysis and climate modeling. Rebecca became an advocate for mental health resources for field researchers, writing articles and speaking at conferences about the psychological toll of traumatic events in remote research settings. The cabin designated CWS-17 was never rebuilt. The site was eventually cleared of debris and the location was removed from the inventory of available research stations. A small memorial plaque was installed at the Churchill Ranger Station, honoring Thomas Richardson and acknowledging the incident as a reminder of the risks faced by those who work to understand and protect Arctic wildlife. In the years that followed, the incident at CWS-17 was extensively studied and discussed within the wildlife management community. It appeared in textbooks as a case study in polar bear behavior under extreme environmental stress. It was cited in policy papers arguing for more aggressive action on climate change. It was referenced in debates about whether humans should continue to conduct research in areas where wildlife populations were becoming increasingly desperate and dangerous. For John Stanton, now 51 years old and living in a comfortable apartment in Arlington, Virginia, the incident remains the defining event of his life. He thinks about it every day, replays the decisions he made, wonders what he could have done differently. Could they have evacuated earlier? Should they have tried harder to scare the bear away before he escalated to attacking the cabin? Should John have insisted on calling for helicopter extraction when the bear first showed up, regardless of the weather risks? These questions have no answers, and John has learned to live with the uncertainty and the guilt. He keeps in touch with the other survivors, exchanging emails and occasional phone calls. They have formed a bond that only people who have survived a shared trauma can understand. They are the ones who know what it was like to stare into the eyes of a starving polar bear and see their own mortality reflected back at them. The story of the attack has been covered by media outlets around the world, though the coverage has often been sensationalized, focusing on the horror and the violence while missing the deeper story about climate change and ecosystem collapse. John has done a handful of interviews, always carefully choosing his words, trying to convey that the bear was not a monster, not evil, but simply a desperate animal doing what evolution had programmed him to do. find food, and survive. Rebecca still keeps the photograph from that last evening in the cabin, the picture of the 8 team members sitting around the table, smiling, unaware of what the next day would bring. Thomas is in the center of the photo, his arm around Marcus's shoulders, grinning broadly. Rebecca looks at the photo sometimes, on the anniversary of the attack or on Thomas's birthday, and she remembers how young they all looked, how confident, how certain that they were prepared for whatever might happen. The polar bear population of western Hudson Bay continues to decline, with more recent surveys showing even more dire body condition indices and lower cub survival rates. The ice-free season continues to lengthen, and the bears continue to come to shore earlier and in worse condition. There have been more incidents of bears approaching human settlements, more encounters that required intervention. So far, there have been no more fatal attacks, but wildlife managers and researchers know it is only a matter of time. The bears are running out of options and humans are in their path. On August 25th, 2029, exactly 5 years after the attack, the survivors gathered in Churchill for a private memorial service. They stood together at the edge of Hudson Bay, looking out over the water, watching the waves roll in under an overcast sky. They did not talk much, did not need to. They were there to remember Thomas, to honor his sacrifice, and to acknowledge what they had been through together. As they stood there, a polar bear appeared on the rocks about half a kilometer down the shore. The bear was an adult female, lean but not emaciated, moving with the fluid grace that only a healthy bear possessed. She stopped and looked at the group of humans, her dark eyes assessing them, and for a moment John felt the old fear rising in his chest, felt his heart rate accelerate, felt the urge to run. But the bear, after watching them for a few seconds, simply turned away and continued walking along the shore, disappearing behind a rocky outcrop. Sarah watched the bear go, then said quietly, "She's looking for seals. The ice will be coming soon. She's going to be okay." John hoped Sarah was right. He hoped that at least some of the bears would be okay, that the ecosystem would find a new balance, that the changes racking the Arctic would not result in the extinction of these magnificent animals. But he was not optimistic. The data was too clear, the trends too dire. As the group prepared to leave the shoreline and return to Churchill, John took one last look at the rocks where the bear had been. The rocks were empty now, just stone and lichen and the eternal waves. But he knew the bears were still out there, hungry and desperate, waiting for the ice to return, waiting for a chance to hunt and eat and survive another year. And he knew that there would be more encounters between bears and humans, more moments when the ancient calculus of predator and prey would play out in ways that would shock and horrify people who had forgotten that the natural world was not a theme park, not a carefully managed garden, but a realm of struggle and violence and death. The bear that killed Thomas Richardson had been a warning, a harbinger of the conflicts to come as climate change continued to disrupt the delicate balance of Arctic ecosystems. John Stanton understood that now, understood it in a way that 17 years of research and dozens of published papers had never made him understand. He had looked into the bear's eyes, had seen the intelligence and the desperation, had watched as the bear made the calculations that led him to attack the cabin and the people inside. And John knew that the bear had not been acting out of malice or hatred. The bear had simply been trying to survive in a world that was changing faster than evolution could keep up with. That knowledge did not make Thomas's death any easier to accept. It did not ease the nightmares or the guilt. But it did give the tragedy a context, a framework for understanding why it had happened and what it meant for the future. As John Stanton walked away from the shore, Rebecca's hand in his, he thought about the title of the paper he had never written, the one that would have used their data from that ill-fated expedition, Behavioral Adaptations of Ursus Maritimus to Extended Ice-Free Periods in Western Hudson Bay. The paper would have been dry, clinical, full of statistics and regression analyses and carefully worded conclusions. Instead, the story that emerged from CWS-17 was written in blood and fear and loss, a story that no scientific paper could capture, a story that would haunt everyone who had been part of it for the rest of their lives. It was a story about the price of human curiosity, the risks of trying to understand a world that was fundamentally beyond our control, and the terrifying reality of what happens when a starving predator decides that humans are food. The sun was setting as they drove back through Churchill, past the polar bear jail where problem bears were held until they could be released, past the tourist shops selling polar bear souvenirs, past the hotels full of people who had come to see the bears from the safety of tundra buggies. John looked at these tourists with a mixture of pity and understanding. They wanted to see the bears, wanted to feel connected to nature, wanted to believe that the Arctic was a pristine wilderness where they could have authentic experiences. But John knew the truth. The Arctic was not pristine. It was changing, collapsing, transforming into something new and unpredictable. The bears were not cuddly symbols of conservation. They were apex predators, intelligent and powerful, and increasingly desperate. And the boundary between observer and observed, between researcher and subject, between human and animal, was thinner and more fragile than anyone wanted to acknowledge. That night in his hotel room, John wrote a long letter to Thomas's parents, something he had been meaning to do for 5 years but had never been able to bring himself to complete. He told them how brave Thomas had been in those final moments, how he had tried to protect the team, how he had stood between the bear and the others, even when he must have known it would cost him his life. John told them that Thomas had died doing work that mattered, in a place that he loved, and that his sacrifice had allowed 7 other people to live. John did not know if the letter would bring Thomas's parents any comfort. He suspected it would not. How could words on paper compensate for the loss of a son? But he sent the letter anyway, because it was the only thing he could do, the only way he knew to honor Thomas's memory. The following morning, John and Rebecca flew back to Virginia, leaving the Arctic behind. As the plane climbed through the clouds and the landscape below disappeared from view, John felt something that might have been relief or might have been regret. He was going home, returning to civilization, putting distance between himself and the place where the worst thing that had ever happened to him had occurred. But a part of him would always remain in that cabin, in that storm, staring at the bear through the broken wall. A part of him would always be running through the darkness, holding Rebecca's hand, listening to Thomas's scream. A part of him would always be that person he had been before August 25th, 2024, the person who thought he understood polar bears, who thought he was prepared for anything, who thought that science and knowledge could protect him from the raw power of nature. That person was gone, killed as surely as Thomas had been killed, though his death had been metaphorical rather than literal. In his place was this new person, scarred and wary, someone who jumped at loud noises, who had panic attacks in crowded spaces, who could not look at images of polar bears without feeling his chest tighten and his breath come short. John Stanton, polar bear researcher, had become John Stanton, polar bear attack survivor, and that label would define him for the rest of his life. It was not the identity he had chosen, not the legacy he had hoped to leave, but it was the truth, and he had learned that the truth, however terrible, was the only thing worth holding on to in a world where so much was uncertain and so much was changing. Years from now, when climate change had progressed even further, when the ice-free season in Hudson Bay stretched from June to December, when polar bears were even more desperate and dangerous, people would look back at the incident at CWS-17 as an early warning sign, a canary in the coal mine, a preview of the conflicts to come. And somewhere in the vast Arctic landscape, other polar bears would be making their own calculations, weighing the risks against the rewards, deciding whether the strange structures built by humans might contain food worth investigating. The bears would remember the lessons learned by the bear that attacked the cabin. They would remember that loud noises and painful impacts were not always enough to overcome the desperate need to eat. The war between humans and polar bears had begun, a war that neither side had chosen, but that was now inevitable, and there would be casualties on both sides before it was over. Thomas Richardson was the first, but he would not be the last, and his death stood as a monument to the consequences of a world transformed by human activity, a world where the old rules no longer applied, and the future was written in blood and ice and desperate hunger. The last light of Hudson Bay had faded on that terrible August evening, and with it had faded the illusion that humans could exist in the Arctic without paying a price, that they could study and observe and document the bears without becoming part of the story themselves, without becoming prey. That illusion was gone forever, and in its place was a new and terrible understanding. In a world transformed by climate change, in a world where ecosystems were collapsing and animals were starving, there were no safe spaces, no guarantees, no walls strong enough to keep the hungry at bay. John Stanton understood this now, understood it in his bones and his blood and his nightmares. And he would carry that understanding with him for the rest of his days, a burden and a warning, a story that needed to be told even though no one wanted to hear it, a truth that was too terrible to speak but too important to silence. The bear was coming. The bear was always coming, and there was nowhere to hide.